Webb.
What's up? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. I'm your host, Ricardo Renz, also known as Ricky Brands, and a great episode for you today. I'm finally back from a little bit of a hiatus. I've had some bad luck of late, had some guests that needed to reschedule, then finally had a day where I had some shows scheduled and I lost power for 24 hours, so it's been a little bit rough. If you guys are Patreon supporters, and you'll find those links to my Patreon page in my show description on my YouTube channel, RV36, or just search Ripple Effect Podcast. I let you know who's booked, who's coming on the Union of the Unwanted shows, guests that I'm in conversations with coming on the show, all that stuff. So you guys would probably know some of the shows that should have been recorded and released by now, and those are some of the guests that I had to reschedule, and I'm sure if I haven't yet, I will update you on when those shows are rescheduled for. But nonetheless, great show today. Whitney Webb and Ryan from The Last American Vagabond are back, and we had a fun, long discussion about everything and anything. As you guys know, I like to kind of dip my toes in so many different topics and perspectives and opinions, and this show is no different. We talk about everything and anything, so many different topics and subjects that I'm pretty sure you probably haven't heard Whitney and Ryan discuss in the past, and I like it that way. We kind of go anywhere the conversation takes us, and I think I get a lot of positive feedback from listeners and definitely a lot of positive feedback from guests who really enjoy the format in regards to a very casual conversation. And you know, some guests have said in the past that I have this talent of making people feel like they're not being recorded, that they're in some personal setting where they can kind of talk about anything and everything. I guess it's a talent. I don't really know how I do it, or even if I have it, it does seem like it does happen that way on the show. I try to do things like record intros later and start recording immediately to kind of capture that casual conversation feeling and not be like, hey, we're on the air now. Because like I've discussed on past shows, once you know you're being recorded, you try to talk as normal and as casual as you would with a personal friend just kind of hanging out. It's always slightly different. I'll try to keep this intro short because I'm already talking for a while. You can tell I haven't done a podcast for a while because I feel like when I don't do one for a while, I'm a little bit more chatty. So I'll try to prevent that because we do have a great conversation ahead. Ryan and Whitney from The Last American Vagabond, they've been on a bunch of times, returning guests, so definitely go back, check out those archives. Just look up the Ripple Effect Podcast and put either one of their names, and you'll be able to find, you know, in any search engine, you'll be able to find past shows with those guests. Also, I'm trying to do this whole value for value system on my website, rippleeffectpodcast.com. You can find a PayPal link also in the show description on our YouTube channel, RV36, or the Ripple Effect Podcast. If you just search the Ripple Effect Podcast, you'll find it. A PayPal link to my PayPal account if you want to tip the show, if you have a little extra cash. If you find value in the show, try to give, if you can, a certain amount of value back. I just hate talking about money. I hate asking for money. I hate talking about money. I'm really just trying to do what I love and hoping that some way things will just fall into place and I'll be able to do this full time and find a way to just, I guess, pay the bills doing this. And with that said, I guess I have to mention this from time to time. You know, I do have a Patreon page if you want to support the show that way. Like I said, I have a PayPal account if you want to tip the show. I also have a new merch store, which I'm super excited about, the Ripple Effect Podcast merch.com. That's merch.com, Ripple Effect Podcast merch.com. And I have hoodies, all types of stuff, t-shirts, different qualities, cheaper ones, more expensive ones, stuff that is really inexpensive, and then stuff that's a little bit higher end in regards to quality. So a little bit of everything, and I'm always working on new logos. I'm kind of going back and forth with some new logos that I'm hoping to release very soon. I just can't decide exactly what I want to do with the logo or the artwork. It's an easy way of supporting the show. On the 12th, I'm not sure when you're listening to this, but October 12th is the next Union of the Unwanted. I'll be live streaming them, I think for the most part from now on my YouTube channel, and it'll be every other Monday unless something happens in regards to schedule. And the next one after this, the 26th, is still kind of up in the air. I have an event I might have to go to or might want to go to, but for the most part, it's going to be every other Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And you can find the links on my social media accounts. So if you follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Parler, Facebook, wherever you follow me, I usually do share those live stream links once they're available. But if you subscribe to my YouTube channel, you should get the notification once we're live. I'll end this here. Hope everybody's well, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.
It's fine now, I think. Sorry.
You gotta love technology.
Yeah, I know. I can't wait for them to force more of it into our lives so that more things can malfunction.
I am recording. Okay, awesome. Yeah, I was gonna do a Zoom, but it just got too late, and then I was running around. Fridays, I don't know. Every day's kind of crazy when you have like a full-time job and kids and everything else.
Imagine.
Yeah, I feel that. Do we all up though in the frame when you record more than 2 people on Skype?
Yeah, I haven't had. Oh, that was the one time. Yeah, that was one time Whitney was left out. We did. I don't know what happened. For some reason.
I don't know. It was 9/11 and Epstein. It was because Corbett was recording too, right? Someone was recording the feed, and I joined the call after everyone. I was like the last one to join, and I got like left out. And then I guess Brock like edited it, but like put my face like mid-word, so my mouth looks like super weird. And that was me. Like the whole video was just like in mid-speech. It was yeah, it's all right. It's fine.
Yeah, I've actually had pretty good luck. I know some people say that they have bad luck with Skype. I've had pretty good luck with Skype. With as often as I use it, it seems like it's been pretty reliable. I mean, Zoom, I don't use quite as much, but you know, I guess it's either or. I mean, they both are going to have issues from time to time.
The only time I've ever had a recording just not be there was with Zoom, but that was when they first started. That was pretty lame. Like a 3.5, like it was a big old podcast, and we just got done, and there was nothing there. And I'm like, what? Pretty bad.
Really?
They didn't even know what to do. I called them. They're like, it's as far as our end's concerned, you didn't even do a show, and it was recording. Like we all saw it. And it's like, what the fuck?
So,
but it never happened again.
Did you have like an audio backup or something like that?
No. See, that was a long time ago, and ever since then, I've done a local recording, and I've never needed it. So.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I always record via Pro Tools for my audio, and then I'll also record the video. So that way, I mean, the Pro Tools audio will be better for the RSS feed for the people who listen to, because most of my listeners are podcasters. They're people who like podcasts and are downloading it and listening it on an app on their phone. And so that's the better quality. But I'll, worst case scenario, if something goes wrong with Pro Tools, because I've had the same thing happen once where I'm like, I swear I saved it when I X'd out, and I couldn't. Had to have like a IT guy that I knew like go through my computer and find some. He's like, it has to be somewhere, and then it took him like a couple hours, but he eventually found like a file somewhere, and I'm like, oh, thank God.
You're lucky.
Yeah, that is really lucky.
Yeah.
So
I had a problem on Skype where it got deleted. I recorded a podcast with Charlie Robinson. It was like 1.5 hours, and at like minute 47, it just no audio. It just left.
Oh man.
Really?
It never came back. Yeah. Yeah, but it's all right. We saved it because we both like recorded our ends, so
yeah,
it was
helps.
Fixable. But I don't trust Skype anymore in Microsoft.
Past the governments or the people. I mean, there's so much going on right now that it's on its obvious manipulation. Like, why wouldn't they do stuff like this? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, really think about it. Like, it makes perfect sense. I hope this isn't a lawnmower outside my window.
Maybe it's a leaf blower.
Gosh darn it. I just saw somebody compare JP to a red-headed high-impact flicks today. That made me laugh.
Yeah, I saw that also. It was pretty funny.
Well, yeah, I guess I wanted to get your guys' origin story, because this is the first time all you guys were together. I was going to try to get like the backstory, how you all got into researching, and then how you got into researching together, the whole crew. But I guess probably Ryan's going to have to fill us in on how he got hooked up with Derek, because Derek's not here. Yeah, I know he's been on the road and he's busy and whatnot.
Yeah. But, well, he just moved countries and then moved houses. So, I mean, he's pretty busy.
Well, I don't know if he wants people to know. Is he being DL about what country he's in, or?
I don't think so.
No, I believe he was talking about setting up a kind of underground railroad for people wanting to go from the United States to Mexico, which is, for some people, just makes their head spin. But it's actually more interesting than you would think. That people are just like kind of trying to flee this country right now in a lot of ways. It's interesting.
Yeah, a lot of people are leaving. I mean, I was
or
thinking
at
about
least
it
temporarily. Let's see what happens in November. I'll take like a couple weeks off outside the U.S. to see how things go down. I mean, some people are looking at it that way, and there's people that want to permanently relocate. I can relate to that, but I did that like years ago. So
yeah,
and we're not talking about the kind of like post Trump election, like I'm gonna leave if he gets elected, like, and then they don't leave. Like, these are people that are like, I can't feed my family. Like, it's crazy that the idea of going from this country, and it not necessarily to state that that's how this country is all the time. I think we're in a really bad way now, but that people are fleeing the United States to go to Mexico for a better life. It just makes me, it's kind of interesting, to think about it like that. Like, it's just like, that doesn't make sense for what we think our world is today. It's interesting. Are we actually recording right now, or
yeah? I'm always recording.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't always use it. Yeah, it's all right. We might as well get right into it.
I learned that the hard way one time.
Well, I usually tell people. So like the first time somebody's on the show, I usually tell them, and then after that, I just assume they know. So many cases, like I'm like, I should have said something, because we'll be like 10 minutes into the conversation, like, wait, are we recording? And I'm like, yeah. Well, what happens is, like, sometimes some of the little chit chat before the show or right in the beginning of the show, it's interesting. You get into some interesting stuff, and you'll be surprised how many people actually enjoy that type of stuff. Like, I've been on Ernest Hancock's show, and he talks about, so he records the whole thing, and if you're listening to it on air when he's doing the radio show, they only hear the stuff that is, I guess, officially the show, but he records even the off-air stuff during the commercials, and he's like, people love that stuff, that like the little chit chat, the little BSing about stuff. I'm like, Ernest, that's my whole show.
All right.
Well, last time Ricky. I was on, just me, Ricky, I had people on Twitter being like, saying that the podcast episode we recorded gave them the Whitney lore that they craved. Like all this random information.
Well, I get both. I get the positive stuff. Like, I get people who are like, oh my God, I got to see that side of that person that I don't usually get to see, because it's like, I'll have a musician on and I won't talk to him about music. Like, if we get to going down some road and it's interesting, well, we won't even talk about music. And I'm like, but who cares? Like, you've heard this person talk about music every interview they do, and so you get into some of their personal lives. So like when I had this guy Cell Dweller on, he's a real popular like electronic musician, and we talked about nothing about his career. It was all about like his personal philosophy, some of his inspirations, and we got into like Orwell and all this other stuff and technology, and people loved it. And then I'll have James on, and I remember one time me and James did like the first like 30 to 40 minutes of the show about parenting. We just started talking because our kids are kind of similar in age, and we're talking about like being a dad and some of the the stuff that comes with that. And people were so mad, because it's like you get James on and you're just like, people would write in the comments like, fast forward the first 40 minutes of dad talk or whatever. And I'm like, dad talk. I'm like, you're not. And then I'm like, he's obviously not a parent, because if you're a parent, it's like, it is hard not to talk about it. But not often do you get that side of James either. It's like, people are human. And that human aspect of it sometimes is really interesting to me. It's like there's more to us than just like, oh, we're just researchers, or we're just influencers, we're just YouTubers. It's like there's all these other things, and I think that sometimes what happens, in our personal lives or our personal views, that kind of helps you better understand our research and some of our perspectives in other things too. So it's all, we're like a complex puzzle, and I think all those pieces are kind of important to understand us, fully. So, and parenting, I mean, it's just one of those things. I think it's like life changing. So it's hard for people. It's almost like
all time consuming.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So,
I mean, booking podcasts like revolves around my job, my wife's job, and then like sitters. Do we have sitters sometimes? Do we have
I can relate to that.
Yeah, it's Brian, do you have any kids?
No, I don't. I told Whitney recently I dated a girl for about 2 years that had 3 and 5 when I first started dating them, and we basically lived together for a period. And so it's like I totally grasp it, but I get that it's not the same thing. I told her jokingly, because I could leave at any time, go home to my place and be, I can check out, leave it on her, But it's definitely something in my life that I eventually want to do for sure. But it's interesting that talking about the other side of the coin. It's like a lot of us have these, and I don't even think it's intentional for most people. Like I definitely don't coordinate like a persona that I want people to see, but you have like your personality, you go on your show and you have a certain way you do things, and it's like you just don't get into all the other stuff. Like I can't remember how many people want me to like just take an entire show and just talk about the books that are behind me. You know what I mean? Like things like that. It is an interesting other side of the story, because we all have lives, they don't know about that as much.
Yeah, and I remember one time we were emailing back and forth, Ryan. I was talking about having you on to talk about some of your chef work, some of that stuff, because to me, like, it's all interesting, and it's like all the little things that make up somebody I find interesting, and I've always been very good at I guess, I don't know, like just connecting with people or whatever, because I'm intrigued with so many different things. And it's like even something like food, like, okay, so what's the ins and outs of it? Like, what's the thinking that goes into this? What's the philosophy goes into that, And it's not that I know. Yeah. Well, I met somebody who, she studied French cuisine, and she was talking about how like everything on the plate is there to complement something else, and all this stuff. And I love restaurants like that. There's one in Connecticut. I live in Massachusetts, but not too far from the border of Connecticut. And this guy's like a true artisan chef, where like everything's made by him, and like everything is crafted by him, and he has this passion for it. And like every little thing you could just tell was like thought out. There's nothing there just for the heck of it. It's like it's there. Art. Yeah, it really is.
I know. I mean, I can tell you most people that I know that were cooks or chefs at some point have a very similar mindset. And it's not just cooks and chefs, and musicians, similar. It's kind of this like almost like, anti-norm, kind of contrarian idea. And a lot of cooks tend to be that way, and so you kind of fall into this path of not wanting to go the normal route. What else can you do? I'm going to go cook at a restaurant, and then you find out you're passionate about it. And it becomes an art form. It's not just about pumping out garbage and food for people. It's about doing it in a way that's healthy, done properly, with good quality food, but then also, like you said, it all comes together. I mean, I could wax about it forever. I mean, it's something that if I hadn't found this desire to do what we're doing now, and felt passionate about that seemingly nobody, even now, and nobody else seems to be covering these important things, if I didn't see that need, I would still be cooking. I mean, that's a huge, it actually is really hard for me not to, I'm really passionate about it. I cook like every night for myself because I desire that. Like anybody out there that knows that's been a cook or a chef, it's almost addictive. It's like being at war. You're in the front lines of people and you're sweating and you're screaming and you're dangerous. There's fire everywhere. It really does feel. I'm serious. Like it's crazy. People out there know.
I just like how you describe it.
And just
like Mountain Doom.
Seriously, and you have these bonds you create with people. There's something special about it. There really is. It's hard to get away from.
Too, so I can relate a little bit to the hectic frontline feeling.
Yeah, which is just as difficult. People don't talk about it. It's the restaurant aspect is so interesting, and you'll find a lot of people that worked in restaurants that do what we do. I think that's an interesting connection.
It's true.
Yeah, well, my wife, she's been in the restaurant business, like as a waitress, a bartender forever, and I've always had a connection with food because I was born in Portugal. My mom still made like traditional Portuguese food, and everything was made at home. I mean, when I would go out to eat with friends, she would get offended. She's like, "I can make that. You don't have to go out." And I'm like, "I just want to. It's the atmosphere. I just want to go." She didn't really get it, but there was an appreciation for some of those old school traditional recipes that are like handed down through the generations, because it's like a lot of times you read a cookbook, it's like somebody's interpretation of what Portuguese food is. It's not really the you know, like my wife would try to ask my mother, like, how do you make that? I'm already thinking about like all the pissed off comments, like Whitney Webb knows so much shit, and you're talking about food. You're talking about.
That's perfect.
But you know, it's like my mother barely pays attention to like how much of this or how much of that, you know, because it's like my wife would ask, and she's like, I don't know a pinch of this, but it's like it's kind of muscle memory, and
she's a real chef. That's instinctual, you know. She knows how much just by looking at it, smelling it, you know.
I had Mariana Van Zeller. She's actually a Portuguese journalist and filmmaker. She did that documentary Oxycontin Express, I think, some years ago. She's been on the Rogan podcast, but she was on, and she had this show. I think when I had her on, she had this show called Breaking Borders, which was I don't know if it was Nat Geo or Discovery or one of those channels, and they would go around and get people who would disagree on things. Like they would get like a Mexican and like a super patriotic Texan, and then they would bring him. She had this world famous chef with her, and he's like, "I'm gonna make food, like food that both sides like, you know, something traditional on both sides, and let's convince them to come together for this free, beautiful meal, and all they have to do is sit there and eat together." And it was a method of trying to get food to bring people together and see how much we had in common. And even though these cultures are so different, I mean, one thing you learn from meeting people from all over the world, and I have a lot of foreigner friends, you know, Lebanese friends, Estonian friends, Polish friends, and is that we all love to eat and have like that community, you know. And it's not just, I think, the eating, it's the whole tradition and celebration that comes with it, you know, of everybody coming together, everybody being around one another, everybody, you know, it's that community. And that's the thing, like the way we live today is dangerous. I mean, and that's why the lockdown thing, and I guess I'm going to try to transition into something that people actually want to hear us talk about. The lockdown thing that's one of those things that like made me the most angry, was that like community and being around each other, like that was so important. So when they first started talking about like shutting down the government and shutting things down for a little bit, I'm like, you know what? I know a lot of fucking people who work way too much, don't spend enough time with their friends and family. I'm like, you know what? This might be a good time to like, you know, for them to kind of, you know, realize what they're missing out on, like all those special moments with your kids and friends and family, because you're trying to consume. And then they're like, wait, this sounds great, but stay away from your friends and family. Right. And if anybody gets together with their friends and family, tell on them. You know, it's like, wait, what? Like, it became like the worst nightmare ever. I'm like, you go to prison, they punish you by putting you alone, even though you're probably hanging out with rapists and murderers and thieves, you know? So it's like, that's literally what we're doing. We're going into isolation willingly and saying, hey, I'm just going to do this, and that's fine because it's for the greater good, and nobody asks questions. And, you know, the No Agenda show would call the masks muzzles, and they really were, because the second you got around other people and you actually started like kind of deconstructing what was going on, you realize like a lot of people would be like, you know what? Like, yeah, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, yeah, there's a lot of question marks, and there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation and whatnot. So it was a great little tactic to get us to, you know, basically, in many cases, go through anxiety, depression, and then almost feel like we need the government to help me through this because I just have all this uncertainty that's driving me crazy. And yeah, so I think it worked out well in that regard.
You know, it's funny. I was thinking in my mind too. I was like, oh, I have a transition in my mind right when you were talking about that same thing. But I was going to say that I wrote a paper when I was in culinary school about that exact thing, about the breakdown of the family unit. And this was before all this. This is, you know, just in general, like people stopped eating together, you know, hey, how was your day? What did you learn? You know, that doesn't happen anymore. And so thinking about what you're pointing out today with the corona, or with all this COVID-19 stuff, it is really interesting how that is definitely something that before this was being attacked in a lot of different ways, right? And that's a whole sidestep to get into. But with what we're at now, it is something that it has shown us that the breaking of that family unit has repercussions for society, for yourselves. And it seems like one of the main things they've done from this is not just, as you pointed out, even your immediate family, right? That you have somebody in your home that you're not supposed to be like hugging. It's just a really gross thing to realize. And I feel like that's a foundational part of what we are, that we need to have that, because that small community of the family, that goes out. You know, you when you have that, then your kids, everything, they have that with their friends, their neighbors, and you do with everybody else. And well, if you don't teach them that, it's just not there, right? And that's what they're trying to break down with all of this. They want us to stop feeling like we are interconnected, like they want us to be against ourselves, as opposed to realizing them, You know, and that's a oversimplification, but it's us versus them today. It really is.
Yeah, that's why I like the last show you guys did together and really just kind of talking about Operation Warp Speed and some of the stuff that was going on there and all the shady stuff in regards to that. Because, the whole Trump thing, it's funny because it's like you can't have a perspective on any issue without people like immediately trying to figure out what team you're on, right? And it's like, I'm not.
God, yeah.
Yeah, you get what I'm saying? Like, it's like, okay, this is just where I stand on this issue. So it's like, like I've been telling people of late, I'm like, listen, like, if I have a stance on an issue and it happens that the left or the right or whoever, the Green Party, has the same stance as I do, that one issue, it doesn't mean I agree with them on everything. Like, so in this situation, or like where we are now in time, like, yeah, in regards to opening up the country and being, I guess, much more willing to or the people who are much more willing to consider the fact that the coronavirus might have been overblown. Yeah, those are the people on the right. I guess I'm on their team in this one issue, but it doesn't mean that I'm a Trump supporter. Just like if this was during the Iraq War, it happens that maybe people on the left, not because they had a moral compass that was good, and in many cases because they're right down the middle and they're looking at facts as facts. A lot of it was just motivated because they hated Bush and he was a Republican. Because if it was Obama, they would have justified. Just like I know people who who still justify Iraq and say, well, he did have some weapons of mass destruction. Oh, well, I think he hit him. Or, well, he was a evil person and it wasn't the worst of things. I'm like, you're justifying.
Are you talking about like John Bolton, like who still defends that war?
Yes, I hang out with John Bolton all the time.
Founding success.
Yeah. So, do you guys want to get into maybe some of the Operation Warp Speed, your new article, and
sure,
stuff, that stuff?
What's really crazy? I went on Graham Elwood's channel to talk a little bit about Warp Speed ago, just a couple days ago, and there were people in the chat accusing me of being part of QAnon because I was, which makes no sense because I'm like criticizing the Trump administration for setting up Warp Speed. It's like the opposite of what QAnon does. But anyway, so like anyone just wants to, I don't know, a lot of times when you're reporting on big issues like this that transcend partisan politics, there's a lot of effort by people to try and herd that into one of the two sides, even if it like makes no sense, because I mean that's what they're defaulting to in a lot of ways is trying to aggravate existing dividing lines between people in order to keep us apart. And that social isolation thing you guys were just talking about is part of that. The more apart we are, the more easier we are to divide, and the easier we are to be collectively screwed over by these people who are planning all this stuff out, behind closed doors in Washington, D.C. and other places, about how they can maintain control and, avoid taking what the people want into account, which is ultimately where a lot of this, I think, ends up coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the Operation Warp Speed stuff, because the thing about Trump, because of his, I guess, being outspoken about oxychloroquine and some of the other things, people tend to think that he's more anti-big pharma than maybe, than he really is. Would you like to? Would you like to burst some people's bubbles real quick?
Oh, wow. I mean, I guess I kind of a professional bubble burster, so I might as well just like.
You do kid parties?
No, but I can so basically Operation Warp Speed, right? How was it originally sold to the public? I mean, if you remember a couple months back in like April and May when they were talking about all this stuff, it was supposed to be what they said, a joint civilian, being HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, with the Department of Defense, the military, jointly, implying that it would be 50-50 HHS and DOD, right? Coming together to produce a medical countermeasure, a vaccine, and therapeutics, they said, but there's no more therapeutics really in this program as it exists now, and that they were going to deliver that by January 2021 to 300 million Americans, which is essentially the entire U.S. population, more or less, right? 320 million, I think, is the U.S. population, roughly. So that was the official plan, right? But it came out, for example, the day of the debate the other week, the organizational chart for Operation Warp Speed came out, and Ryan and I covered this recently. It's essentially entirely the military. And the other crazy thing of it is that from the beginning, Operation Warp Speed said they would be transparent. And this goes back to these goals that the Trump administration wrote a year or two ago, saying that they were going to foster transparency as a way to engender public trust, essentially talk a lot about how transparent they are, not necessarily be the same as actually being transparent, but talk a lot about transparency in order to get people to trust their initiatives. So Operation Warp Speed likes to talk in their official press releases on the defense.gov website and other places about how transparent they're being. But in reality, it is probably the most secretive military operation ever aimed at the domestic U.S. populace in history. That's at least in the sense of it being done technically in public, but not really in public because of the extreme secrecy, because we know this operation is there and we know it's going on and it gets covered by mainstream media, so it's not 100% secret. But the details of what's going on within Warp Speed are secret, essentially.
And they have a budget of like $10 billion or something.
It's actually
ridiculous.
more than, they spent more than $10 billion though.
And $450 million, right? Just a little bit over the top.
Yeah. $10 billion has gone specifically to vaccine companies and vaccine manufacturing and presumably distribution. And all of that, and $6 billion of that is for our research and development of a vaccine, specifically a handful of different companies, a lot of which have ties to the U.S. government, like Moderna, which, their product pipeline was developed by DARPA, essentially, which is part of the Pentagon. So, and what's also crazy about this organizational chart, a lot of the representatives of the vaccine industry are also associated with the military, including Moderna's representative in Operation Warp Speed. Novavax and Sanofi are represented in Operation Warp Speed by military personnel. That's not normal. Also, most of the civilians, quote unquote civilians involved in this, are the vaccine company representatives that aren't the military. So the civilian aspect of Operation Warp Speed isn't really HHS or the FDA or the CDC. It's the vaccine companies of who most represents the civilian aspect, which is really small. Out of the 90 leaders of this operation they list, 60 of them are active duty military or military intelligence. And the rest of them are, HHS or vaccine companies. And some of the people that are involved in HHS, like the guy that I love to hate on probably more than anyone else, Robert Kavlick, who's Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. He's really involved in a lot of these Warp Speed things, but he's not on the chart. And also we know that Jared Kushner, for example, involved in this, and he's not really, he doesn't appear to be on the chart. There is someone with the last name Kushner, but they say they're military. I don't know if that's supposed to refer to Kushner or not. Of course, the military isn't going to comment to me about my questions about their stupid little chart. So I just kind of have to see what I can confirm and not confirm, right? But there's a lot of different aspects to it. But the secrecy is the thing that just stands out the most. The contents of the vaccine contracts themselves are secret, and they were not done directly between the government and the vaccine companies. That were funneled through a third party with the express purpose of keeping them secret and also exempting them from federal safety regulations. This is very alarming because a lot of these vaccine companies have very bad safety track records, including Johnson & Johnson, one of the companies that got over $1 billion through Operation Warp Speed in one of these secret contracts, had asbestos in their baby powder for decades and knew about it and kept selling it. So exempting a company like that from federal safety regulations is crazy. Why are we doing that? The other thing, the clinical trials for the vaccines, also secret. No one knows the parameters of those trials. No one knows how those trials are being constructed, how the data is being analyzed, any of this. And of course, the time frame, we also don't know. How long are the safety trials versus efficacy trials? How many people are being studied for safety effects? All of this is is being entirely hidden. But what they did mention recently, and Ryan and I covered this recently, is that everyone that's going to get the Operation Warp Speed vaccine is going to be monitored by the federal government for 2 years after they receive the vaccine through what they call a pharmacovigilance study. And basically you become the guinea pig to see what the side effects to the vaccine are, because they say we're going to continue safety to ensure the safety of the product after we mass distribute it to the entire U.S. population, or so they say, or most of the U.S. population, right?
And
so
I was going to add that this is the part where Whitney and I covered all this as well on the show. This is the part that really, from my angle, what I've been covering is really alarming to me. The Moncef Slaoui, and this is again more on the conspiratorial side, but the idea is that all of these people, most of them, I should say, to be specific, involved in this program are people that have been outspoken, discussed, involved in projects that are discussing things like biosensors, injectable nano platforms. Like these are the kind of things
but
that they're all.
I don't see how that's conspiratorial. I mean, because you just said it sounds conspiratorial, but like yeah, and I understand why you might think that, right? But the people that are saying that, in my opinion, are full of shit. Because what happens when you literally put the people in charge of the secret vaccine and you give them all this secrecy and all this money and this blank check to spend as much as they want and do whatever they want behind closed doors, when they're on record saying that their biggest interest and what they want to make the future of medicine involves injecting people with this stuff.
Right. That's where I was going. Right. I mean, it's completely secret is the point. Right. So how would we know otherwise? And these are people that are adamant about the idea that this is in our best interest or this is the future of medicine. And so, and as I point out before, that Moncef Slaoui was pretty clear about when this would be coming around to existence, which is pretty much right now, and it's just an interesting development. And I think we see the fact that this all ties in with the future that they're building. Right. I mean, what she's talking about is pharmacovigilance and tracking people. Well, you could talk about, literally talking to people and going and over social media, or we might just end up seeing some rollout in the next so many months that goes, oh, what do you know? Because they make a clear point more than once to say they're going to be involving the newest technologies, whatever this may be. Of course, now they're going to be implying the things like the Profusa chip and the injectable, these things are what they are talking about being used to predict whether you're going to get sick, to predict all of these different things, right? So it just seems almost it's just not feasible for them to track all these people without something like that, in the way that they're talking about. So that's what that stands out to me. And I get your point, and I don't think it's conspiratorial, but people could see it that way, but these are things that are very easy to look up.
Well, people see it that way because they've literally been told that thinking that could happen is crazy talk, when in fact a lot of the people involved in this stuff openly talk about that being the future from their perspective. So like the Profusa chip, for example, is something that is not science fiction. It is a company that is, Google has a ton of money in that. Right? It was co-developed by DARPA. The guy that developed that at DARPA is the go-to vaccine coordinator for Operation Warp Speed, former DARPA program manager in the Biological Technology Office, Matt Hepburn. So the guy that literally developed that and says that's what we have to do to prevent future pandemics is the guy that's in charge of coordinating the entire Operation Warp Speed vaccine. And believe it or not, the Profusa chip is going to be approved, so they've been saying in mainstream media, not conspiracy, right? In January 2021, which is the same month that Operation Warp Speed is claiming that's going to go operational, right? And they're saying that they're going to monitor everyone that gets the vaccine for 24 months, while the Profusa chip works in the human body. So it all seems very convenient. Am I going to say it's definitely in there? I mean, we don't know because it's super secret, but based on what we do know and where they're trying to take this, and also, the broader issue of there's this huge push by government to try and harvest as much data from people in the U.S. as they can because of all this whole AI arms race with China that really doesn't get talked about enough. And how can we harvest more data from a smaller population, because the U.S. population obviously much smaller than the Chinese population? How can we get more data than China? What they're saying, this is not the national security state, and also Silicon Valley are saying that we have to essentially go farther than anything China has done in terms of surveillance. And how could they do that? Well, the direction they're taking based on what the government is openly funding and researching are injectables and wearables. Yeah. So
have you guys talked about the smart cities at all? I know a couple of the Union of the Unwanted ones episodes, people have brought it up, and it's pretty effing scary when you look at like the amount of tracking they're expecting to do in these smart cities. I mean, it's
that's all about getting data from everything. If you put sensors everywhere, all those sensors are constantly creating a constant stream of data. So basically the idea from these guys' perspectives, right, and they justify this out of national security, right, because we have to maintain hegemony against China militarily and economically, and the way to do that is to be the market leader and also have the best AI weapons and all this stuff. It's all about AI at the end of the day, right? So it's how many sensors can we have? We need more sensors than the Chinese have. That's basically what their plan is, right? What they're justifying and where this is ultimately going. So we have where we are now, what we can see developing now, but we also need to keep in mind where they plan to take this, including the same people that are behind Operation Warp Speed, the Pentagon. The Pentagon is modernizing itself right now in the process of that. They started it a couple weeks ago in something called Project Convergence. And basically they have an entire command of the military that was set up just 2 years ago, not Space Force, I'm talking about something else, that was specifically set up to develop to modernize the Army. And it's all about AI, connecting soldiers' brains to machines and all of this other stuff like cyborgs. I mean, this sounds really crazy, but the Super Soldier DARPA program really got supercharged with Dick Cheney after 9/11. He signed off on all this stuff. So this has been going on behind the scenes, at DARPA for 2 decades. So we have to keep in mind where they want to take this, because a lot of the things we're seeing play out now, especially with the election, all the chaos they want to create so they can come in and impose and restore order. How are they going to do that? And the timing of them needing to restore order because of the election chaos coincides with when Operation Warp Speed is going to go operational. You have to keep in mind all these different parts, and also the fact these modernization plans and this AI stuff and the smart city sensor stuff they want to put everywhere, they're not going to put this shit to a vote, people. They're not going to ask you your opinion. Obviously, Americans would be like, no thanks, please don't mandate this. But they're saying our national security will suffer gravely and will never recover hegemony if we don't do this. They're not going to ask you. They're just going to do it. Just like they invaded Iraq or, did all this other stuff without asking you. It was all about economic and military hegemony, and that's what this is about too. So, okay, you don't want to wear your cool new Amazon-made whatever fitness wearable that tracks your pulse and sends it to a centralized government database or whatever. They're not going to ask you. They're just going to be like, they're going to try and mandate that stuff at some point. So would they do it through the vaccine? It's possible, because this is what the military wants, and this is the world they're trying to create within the U.S., all under the justification of, we have to beat China because China's bad. Why is China bad? Well, they're authoritarian. Okay, so we're going to create a worse, more Orwellian authoritarian state, so we're number one. I mean, but that's basically how these people are thinking. It's all about staying number one at the end of the day.
Logic. See, what this brings to me, to my mind, is the direction after this, using these sensors and different things. I just reported on the bomb sniffing or bomb detecting robots that are now being transited into discovering coronavirus. And so we're talking about a world they're building with these sensors everywhere that they can then use and be like, it's going to happen in 2 weeks, which is what they're saying. We can predict it 3 weeks out. So then you create this world where you can just be, all of a sudden we got like we saw in New York City with the red thing on the top of the building. Everyone be scared. We have an alarm. 3 weeks from now, we're all going to get sick. Everybody lock down and put your masks on, right? And then they can come around a week later and go, good thing we did that, because now we're not going to get sick because we took action. The point being, we never know if anything was going to happen. It's the same idea with the war on terror, the kind of the medical pre-crime is what we would call
fear stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And we just have to trust. And as Whitney's work has pointed out, Bill Barr has talked about this, in regard to mass shootings, in regard to terrorism, and now it's just being applied like everything else because of the next excuse that they have. And another thought that I had, going back to the first thing you brought up about hydroxychloroquine and all of this, is it's interesting the way that this evolution of that story is driving into the reliance on the vaccine, which was the one thing that these people were adamant about in the beginning. It's Fauci, it's Gates, it's the vaccine, it's, and we should all be afraid of this. But now, because it's become Trump's vaccine, now it's suddenly like, we have to stop the Democrats from keeping us vaccine from us beforehand. Alex Jones talk about the fact that that's what Trump is doing. That he knew they were going to do it in 2021, so he grabbed it and did it early, so he's giving us the good one. It's the same damn vaccine. Like, this is ridiculous. And my point was that the Regeneron aspect of this, where it was hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir, has now kind of driven into this one decision, which again is not, like, hydroxychloroquine was cheaper and so on. It just seems like it's going to set up a perfect scenario where that thing that may be the alternative is not going to either be available or be too expensive, and people will be driven into the vaccine. And that's what Trump is doing. They're all doing it. But I think it's important for the supporters of Trump to see that he's equally driving them into this same outcome, which then leads into all the discussions that we just had. You know, and that's the world that they're building with this.
Right. Good point. So going back to what you're asking about the smart cities, Ricky. So Ryan sort of alluded to this. So my last report was about a push that's going on right now, and they expect to have it operational in 42 states by the end of the year. But they're basically calling a national wastewater surveillance system, surveilling and testing your sewage to see what's inside. And they're going to, the HHS, the federal government, plans to use this to predict COVID-19 outbreaks up to 11 days before symptoms would even begin to emerge, based on predictive analysis of the presence of RNA fragments of COVID-19 in people's poop, basically, or in sewage, right? So what if you pour something down the drain? It's not even like, you know, human excrement or whatever. It gets poured down the drain and happens to trigger that, you know, RNA sequence that is affiliated with COVID-19, because a lot of these COVID-19 tests, I'm not even talking about the PCR tests. I'm talking about like these different tech startups that are claiming to test for COVID-19 and predictively diagnose or predict outbreaks of COVID-19. They don't actually use anything isolated from the virus itself. A lot of them use analogs or imitates and things like that of what they assume COVID-19 is, and things like that. So anyway, they plan to predictively analyze whatever they sample from sewage to determine which communities will likely have a COVID-19 outbreak, and then rapidly contain whatever that means, those communities, which essentially means, you know, a state mandated lockdown, curfews. I mean, you can kind of imagine what that would entail, right? So this is basically being done right now. But of course, this system would rely on a series of sensors. And of course, all the smart city models also involve managing, you know, data that comes out of sewage, right? There's a lot of things you can obtain, a lot of information you can obtain from sewage. You can also obtain people's DNA directly from that. As well, which is interesting. We consider there's been a lot of interest by these the predator class, the oligarchs, whatever, in buying up DNA, things that would give them access to a lot of information on Americans' DNA. For example, Blackstone Capital buying Ancestry.com, right, which is based on DNA tests and things like that. That's one of many recent moves in this field. But the people that are going to get this contract, it's a spinoff of MIT, from MIT, called BioBot. And it comes out of a lab at MIT that's called the Sensible Cities Lab. And it's not sensible like, oh, that's sensible, it makes sense. It means able to sense, meaning like it's sensor enabled, right? All enabled by sensors. So, you know, this is their Underworlds project, which is all about the underground infrastructure of smart cities. So that is the company that's going to get this contract, essentially, because it was made for them. As I point out in my report, they said it was going to be open to bids from various companies, but they only had it up for less than 24 hours, and then it closed, and it had to go to a woman-led, minority-owned business, which is BioBot, and they didn't notify anyone, and so BioBot slides in there and gets the contract all very convenient, right? That's not normally how these things work, so it definitely seemed to have been gamed in their favor. But, you know, MIT is where a lot of this, the labs of these, of this great reset push, at least in the U.S., operate. You know, we've talked about before on TLab about like Bob Langer and his lab that was funded by Gates, and how they do the sort of like a tattoo thing or whatever to show that you got a vaccine, under the skin record of vaccination. Also the remote control birth control insert and things like that, all developed at MIT and funded by Gates. And so a lot of this either goes on at MIT or Harvard in terms of R&D for a lot of these things. You see those two universities pop up time and again, at least over the course of this past year. So basically, there's a couple different ways to look at this, and there's a couple of different angles to this sewage surveillance story. One is that the same lab has plans and has actually previously partnered with DHS to use this to detect areas that engage in illicit drug use. So that opens it up immediately to a war on drugs angle where, oh, there's a lot of people smoking pot here, time to go door to door and find all the weed that people aren't supposed to have, among other things, right? So they can use it for that. They also have this company talks about using it to decide if people are eating healthy enough. And if they detect too much unhealthy food in people's sewage, then the state government or city government or whatever can impose a sugar tax or a ban on certain types of foods or things at the grocery store that they say are associated with illnesses and things like this. So it's definitely a totalitarian tiptoe, if you will, in that sense. And there's another aspect to this we can get in later, which is this very Orwellian database called HHS Protect, where all of this data, not just all the COVID-19 data has to go there per the federal government now that's mandated. They're forcing all hospitals to send it to this database, or they'll revoke funding from hospitals, Medicare and Medicaid funding. But it's being managed by Palantir, which is very alarming because they're like the CIA, basically. We can get into that later. So that's, another angle. But I would argue, in terms of what this means in terms of big picture stuff, that infrastructure, even if COVID-19 ends, those sensors will remain. And this essentially means, this is really what I would argue is the first step toward a nationwide, coming from the federal government, push to create national smart city infrastructure. But they're doing it underground so people can't physically see it, right? So they won't be, out of sight and out of mind. They won't be freaking out about it right away and being like, what's all this stuff, But it's the first push. And, obviously if you want to stop the smart city push, the best time to start pushing back is when they first start launching it, which would be now, because that's what they're doing.
And don't forget, everyone out there, that they're talking about 5G, Internet of Things, right? That's what this is going to be. That's the main point, right? This whole thing is they've been building this for a long time, and we know the dangers involved. They don't care to look at them. They continue to hide that information. And I love Whitney's point about this, that they're basically building this out underneath us right now without us even being aware of it to a degree. And then once it's there in the bottom, it just, I've also mentioned the not just those robots, but there was another story where they were building, and actually I believe you probably know, but they've already done this to a degree, or tried to, in regard to sensing, either bio attacks or terrorism attacks. They are already trying to implement these type of 5G scenarios that go on like every lamppost that can sense whether there's a COVID-19 outbreak or so on, right? So it's all this kind of, you can see it all coming together. And I think we all know where, the idea that you're not allowed to talk about 5G today shows you that there's something that we need to be paying attention to there, I think, very clearly.
Yeah, I think that's the case with many things. I think when the pandemic documentary, they went to such lengths to take that offline. I mean, they took down their website. They locked Dr. Judy Mintzevich, or however you pronounce her name, her Wikipedia page. They went to in 24 hours, literally, like, it went viral, got taken off the internet, and there's already debunking articles and videos, which is hysterical. I'm like, oh, you guys already researched everything she said and fact-checked it and are good to go to put up a debunking video. So I think that does, in some circumstances, like, make people more curious and more skeptical about, like, okay, why are they going to such lengths to not let me see this and not come up with my own opinion when there's so many other things. I mean, on Twitter, for example, the whole QAnon thing, and I don't think any of us are really subscribers to the whole QAnon thing, but the point is, people could still, like, if people want to, believe all that, then that's okay. Like, that, I don't see a real justification to remove a bunch of QAnon accounts, or people who are supporters. And then you look at it on Twitter, there's still porn. There is still, I had her name's Chrissy. I forget what her last name is, but she's been on one of our Union of the Unwanted shows, and she was actually exposing, like, child or porn accounts and saying, Twitter, why are these still up? Why are these still up? And people were commenting that they were reporting them. and they were still up. People were double checking, later in the day, and they were still up. And it's just one of those things where it's just like, wait, I thought you were supposed to be protecting people, and you had some guidelines, and it was all about, protecting people from violence or something that could lead to violence or something illegal. And it's like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, it's the perfect example of like, okay, you're giving, I mean, it's obvious that there's tons, everybody knows there's tons of porn accounts on Twitter. Like, why, if you're protecting children or you're protecting people from whatever, then why are these accounts still there? And there's no effort whatsoever to take these things down. So, I mean, just people have to come to terms that it's like, I don't know if you guys watched Social Dilemma, the documentary. It like started off okay, and I'm like, oh wait, I'm like, it's not too bad, and then it's like they went into like, oh, how dangerous it is for conspiracy theorists and Pizzagate and all this stuff, and I'm just like, you
That's
can
the whole point of that thing.
Yeah, well, initially,
well, now there's a mainstream media guy that says the Epstein scandal is a gateway to QAnon.
Jesus.
But wasn't that like just covered in mass by mainstream media as not being a conspiracy theory and being real, but now it's a gateway to QAnon? Okay, so basically they're just trying to discredit the whole thing because it's pervasive, and there's a lot of historical scandals in the U.S., often involving high-ranking politicians like Dennis Hastert, the former Speaker of the House, for example, or intelligence agencies, in child trafficking. But to build off of your example on Twitter, Amazon has been under fire from parent advocacy groups because there's child porn on its cloud servers and they won't take it down. But at the same time, Amazon wants you to think that they're going to partner with this Ashton Kutcher NGO to save kids, and that they're going to, use their facial recognition software to help track down children. That's what they're saying, right? But they won't take child porn off their servers, but they care so much. Jeff Bezos cares so much about protecting kids. And the same thing with Microsoft. Microsoft's Bing, if you search without the safety whatever on, you can type in whatever, keyword you would imagine would easily bring up, child porn, and it will be there, and they don't block it. And even Google's blocked it. But Microsoft has not taken action for years, and there's like parent advocacy organizations calling this out. Why won't they do it? There's also not been a lot of attention given to the fact that the main computer software engineer that manages like whatever at Bill Gates's personal mansion was arrested for having insane amounts of child porn, and not just like sexual violence, but like physical violence against kids. And he got off super light. I mean, that is weird. Yeah.
This is a recurring issue with this country. I recommend people go back and dive through the website, Last American Vagabond. There's just years of this stuff from more, before all this current chaos. But it's interesting that I think it's important for people to think about too, that what Ricky was pointing out is they're not just saying like, look, these are things that are being reported to them. And we've been seeing this for years, from YouTube, from even Instagram, Twitter, where it's not just that it's there, but people are literally in mass sending in notifications, reporting it, flagging it, and then documenting the fact, look, it's been 2 weeks, guys. We can see this like violent pornography, and you're leaving it there. And during the same time frame, documenting how they will remove, say, people discussing things that were about the Pizzagate story that we're not allowed to talk about, or all these different discussions that were just simply discussions, right? There was nothing, they just say talking about these things that aren't real, according to them, are more dangerous than the actual violent child pornography that you can find on their sites. And then we can go into the idea of how there's been numerous examples of the New York Times, numerous examples in all kinds of mainstream media, especially predominantly in the UK, normalizing the idea of something like pedophilia, right? So you have to see that there's at least a ground there that they're standing on that doesn't align with this aggressive idea to, remove all this horrible stuff, which should be the case, right? It should, yeah. Someone like Anthony Weiner, for instance, the article about they were respect Anthony Weiner, he's a sexual deviant. Trying to play this game on people's minds,
Well, there's also this TED Talk that came out saying like pedophilia is like it should be normalized and all that stuff. I don't know if you saw that, but yeah, there's definitely, and then the Netflix cuties thing and a controversy and all this stuff. I mean, there definitely has been a push in some mass media circles for this. Even a couple years ago, Miley Cyrus had a music video where she's like making all these sexual poses and like licking lollipops, but she's wearing like a diaper and a baby bonnet and all this. Not really doubt that was Miley Cyrus's idea. You know what I mean? A lot of this stuff comes from these executives whose names we don't necessarily know, who have some sort of agenda. And, you know, it's no coincidence that there were clear and obvious ties between the network Jeffrey Epstein was running and Harvey Weinstein out in Hollywood. So, you know, it's obviously kind of hard when you're someone like me to investigate all of those ties without, you know, help from the government or these other groups that are supposed to be holding these people to account, but actually work as their personal cover-up agents, right? But I mean, that's stuff that's publicly on the record, those ties between what Epstein was doing with targeting politicians and then, you know, being tied up with someone who was, you know, a sexual predator in Hollywood, and how this is really pervasive in a lot of those power structures, whether it's political power structure or entertainment. You know, it's definitely something that should not be relegated to the realm of conspiracy theory just based on what is publicly known and verifiable. But they, you know, that is a tactic to keep people from talking about it and to have people dismiss it for whatever reason, either so it can continue to go on behind closed doors or so it can be normalized and start to come out in the open, which it seems like, you know, there's definitely some sort of push for that to an extent that should really alarm a lot of people.
Yeah, another example. Oh, sorry. Right.
No, I'm just going to add real quick to make you guys, people out there should look into Dennis Hastert. You're right. That's the best example, because second in line to the president, the judge called him a serial child molester. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's incredible. And this is something that we're supposed to pretend is impossible. Right.
How did he get so high in government, being a serial child abuser and no one knowing at the same time that Epstein was operating in that same circle?
Yeah,
I mean,
there's a documentary, Call Me Lucky. It was about the life of Barry Crimmins. He was a stand-up comedian. He passed away not too long ago. But in that film, because he was molested as a child, and in that film, he's one of the guys who fight with AOL, who had basically chat rooms for people who wanted to, like, you know, share child porn, and AOL wouldn't take him down. You know, it was like dedicated pedophilia chat rooms, and then he ended up fighting with them, and I think eventually AOL ended up taking him down. But it's just an example of how, like, big corporations, they don't care. I mean, there must have been some financial reason to why those chat rooms, you know, there was a reason not to take them down, or it's something even worse, like, you know, these people actually subscribe to this. I'm willing to go down any rabbit hole and entertain any argument. And some years ago, this was probably like the first or second year I did my podcast, so like maybe 5 years ago or something like that, I had the filmmaker who did a documentary called "Are All Men Pedophiles?" And it was actually a really interesting documentary, because so what happened was the filmmaker was looking, like, he found himself being attracted to younger girls, and he didn't know exactly what age they were, but he's like, why? Like, I almost feel like a pedophile because she seems kind of young, and why should I be attracted to her? Like, so he started asking these questions. I know Whitney's ready to give me the look.
Well, I'm not. I'll go on.
So the idea of, like, historically, right? It was quite normal for women, because of, like, the life expectancy being low. You didn't know, you know, if you're going to get disease or whatever. So women, when they hit puberty, was actually historically made the most sense. That was when you're at the healthiest to actually have children. So people kind of blur this idea of pedophilia. Like, apparently there's if it's before puberty. So if you're attracted, because if people don't know this, but around the world, the legal age is different all over the place. It's not the same. It's not like there's a standard, like this 18 number, where that's what we consider an adult isn't actually and I'm not justifying pedophilia. Obviously, I'm a father. But I'm just saying that there is something to, like, this argument that, like, okay, well, you know, for example, it's not as cut and dry, because we look at, like, somebody who's like 18 and then their girlfriend's 17, right? And then they end up getting, you know, and it's like, so we kind of put everything in the same thing, and it's like so they say he talked to historians. He looked at, and now I'm trying to dig myself out of a hole because I already feel like I'm in one.
No, I just have some comments is all. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. So what I found interesting, right, was because there is something about, like, so what he found was that men were attracted to women, you know, their age, and then, you know, after they hit puberty, and then as you get older, I guess in many cases, men actually don't lose that attraction to younger women. And what I mean younger, I don't mean like any specific age. I just mean like after puberty. And it was because historically it actually made sense. I mean, I forget how old the Virgin Mary was when, supposedly she had Jesus, but like she was like 16 or something like that, or 13 or something like that. Like historically, it was actually, it made sense biologically to have children when you're a little younger because of that. So
I don't know if that's actually accurate though. Like if I could just say that, I don't know. I think that at some point, there was a lot less. There's always been deviance throughout history.
Yeah.
That doesn't change because you go back a long time ago. I think
like in ancient Greece, like old men screwed young boys,
Very
and that was like normal, right?
Yeah.
I have to grab something really quick. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Keep talking. Sorry.
Yeah. So I guess my point is more about the fact that we say, if I look at somebody and they're like 21 and they're considered a pedophile and they're 17, I don't put, the girlfriend 17, I don't put them in the same category as somebody who, like, when I think of like the work, like Dennis Hastert, Epstein, these girls were obviously very young. It's just, there's they use I guess a general term for all this, but I don't, I almost, to me, like, and this documentary was very controversial. People like protested it and all this stuff. And it was more just a curious person who was looking into the history. He even, weirdly enough, actually found some actual pedophiles to actually talk about their issue. I might
have seen some things about this or some clips, but I haven't seen it. But I would argue, just by my kind of gut, based on what you're talking about, it seems like this may be a kind of a way to make it seem like this is something to be dealt with, as opposed to, like, for instance, a couple things in there. First of all, a pedophile is a very specific term, and you made that point.
It is.
So someone 18 and a 16 or 17, that's not. There's a difference between being a sexual deviant, which you could apply there if the situation necessitated it, but the difference there, like you said, is prepubescent. There's actually different terms for the different things. All of these are sexual deviants, and all of them should be held accountable, which I'm sure Ricky agrees with, obviously.
Yeah, I guess my point was that it's in many cases, like, I look at people, like, we look at Dennis Hastert, who was taking advantage of little kids. Like, when I use the word a pedophile, or, that's the type of stuff that I think people, because it almost like, everybody gets put in the same category. And I can see the argument that, historically, I get the idea women's bodies, like right when they hit puberty, like they don't change, like they're no more ready at 35 or 25 than they are at like 17 or 18 if they to have children. And so and your body's very smart. I mean, I don't know if you know about like bodybuilders, but like women will not be able to have kids if they're too lean because they don't have enough fat storage on their body or whatnot. So it seems like biologically it makes sense that women, after they hit puberty, that they're basically ready to start reproducing. Now,
I guess I would just argue that they're separate things, right? I mean, like, just because that's the case doesn't then necessarily mean that that's then okay, right? And I know you agree with that, right? So
I agree with that.
A point I'd like to point out, though.
We can't.
Like
you seem really low. Your microphone.
Really? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Is it better?
It's little. It was louder before. I feel
just a little low is all.
Really?
We can hear you, though.
Oh. Well, I can unplug the mic and just use my computer.
That sounds good.
No, you sound good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that, so like people like Alan Dershowitz, right, Epstein pal, he argues that the age of consent should be lowered to when a girl gets her period, right? So when she enters puberty. It's worth keeping in mind, because of all the hormones and meat and all this stuff in the industrial food system, girls are getting their periods earlier than historically ever before, which I think is a major flaw in this biological evolutionary argument. Okay, so if historically, puberty, it was when girls hit puberty, well, several centuries ago, the age of puberty was much higher than it is now. I mean, it was like 14, 15, even for men, right? In terms of like the change of voices, the deepening of voices. You look at like church choirs and stuff that have like the ages of the boys and church choirs in like Catholic churches like centuries ago. It was they would maintain that child voice until much older. so the introduction of a lot of this hormone, specifically like like the growth hormones and stuff, and beef and all of this stuff has, among other things in the environment, has changed that to a significant degree. And now you have girls as young, it's normal for like an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old girl to get her period, which is very different than the historical biological argument that you're having a 14, 15-year-old, which is quite close to the legal age of consent in the US, which is 16, right? So, that argument, in my opinion, doesn't fly anymore. And the people that are trying to make that argument in the US today, I think they're doing so disingenuously because, an 8-year-old girl, okay, she gets her period, but even if you want to argue her body's ready, it's not. It's caused by these environmental changes. Also, there's the separate issue of, how historically, women didn't necessarily have ownership over their own bodies, or were forced into arranged marriages at very young ages because, oh, this is time for you to pop out, you're a baby factory and all of this stuff. I'd like to think that in today's society, that's like not the kind of norm that we want to establish. And there's also the issue of, emotional and cognitive development. What does it take for child rearing? What sort of changes in terms of maturity have to go on for a woman to be able to become a good mother and things like that? But, all of this about, is it okay? They're not talking about motherhood and child rearing. They're talking about, they want to stick it in, is basically what they're saying. Right, which is a totally different angle from a lot of that stuff. So I think, maybe there is something to that evolutionary argument. I've heard it before about why older women dye their hair blonde. It's because there's this sort of evolutionary thing subconsciously with men that they associate like younger youth with blonde hair, because a lot of people, their hair gets darker as they get older or whatever. So, I mean, there may be some of that, okay, but the way people making that argument today are people like Alan Dershowitz, essentially.
Yeah. Well, like you said, like even physically, if they're ready, mentally, there could be some issues there where you're obviously taking advantage of somebody.
Well, and that's the point, because then you're creating a situation of, it's an abuse of power by the older person who knows how to manipulate the younger person, and the younger person remains not just with the effects of the physical abuse or the physical encounter or whatever it ends up being, but emotional and psychological scars, why they're still emotionally and psychologically developing. Right.
Well, you talked about. Oh, I was going to just say one other example to what you're talking about, how the diet affected us as humans. I've done a lot of shows on diet and nutrition, and the lack of fats and protein, because having a higher fat diet, like a keto diet or a paleo diet where you're eating a lot more animal fats, or a carnivore diet even, your testosterone levels, your hormone levels actually increase, and your jawline. So the human jawline will actually be like our ancestors, where they were more square. And you look at like our primitive ancestors, they could fit all their teeth in their mouths. And as our diets changed, our faces have become, I guess, more narrow. And then that's why now, like, everybody has problems with that. It's because of the change of diet. A lot of people tend to believe. So you're absolutely right. Like, a lot of this changing of diet, what with the lack of nutritional value that's in our food, this goes back to eating, food, and right where we started. And it can affect all that. But yeah, I guess the only reason I brought it up was because I find it fascinating, and I think these are conversations, like another conversation I have. These are fascinating because I think there is a difference between like my wife's 4 years older than me. Like if she was 18 and I was 14, she'd be a child molester. I still call her one from time to time.
This is what I was going to say a moment ago, is that it comes down to, it's something that we need to really broaden out to everything we're dealing with today. Just because something is societally accepted doesn't actually make it okay or make it right, or legal. Just because legal doesn't make it right or moral. And if I could, you guys tell me if you want to talk about this, I could pull this into an equally contentious discussion, but with more fine point. And what you just kind of said there is interesting. You guys might have seen this whole, I forget his first name. It's Representative Weiner, not Anthony Weiner, but this other guy who passed or trying to pass this legislation in regard to a very specific bill that's talking about giving the judge the discretion about whether to label somebody a pedophile or a deviant, even though they may get charged with a crime. And the specific discussion is about an age gap between somebody, like this example. So say you're 19 and they're 16 or whatever, and that technically that's a violation. And right now, as it stands before this discussion of the bill, the judge has the discretion essentially to be like, well, they were dating when they were 17 and 16, and now it's not the same thing, but he's still going to be charged with the crime. Except that didn't apply to LGBTQ people, which I don't really know why that makes sense, but they said it had to be certain kinds of intercourse, and so it didn't apply to them. And so this new bill is talking about allowing the judge to broaden that out and be able to make that discretion in regard to certain situations. However, it got picked up, and there is equally areas in that thing for abuse as well. But it got picked up by one side of the political argument, and it's that's a pedophile bill, and they're allowing pedophilia, and that's not really what it is. Clearly, there's room for that to be bad, but they're still being charged with a crime. It's really down to the judge deciding, right? So this is the point being is this is the kind of dilemma. Is that a problem, or is it really just the place we're in now, where people have relationships that overlap in that area, and should that be the judge's discretion? I'm not sure where I stand, but it's an interesting point in all of that,
Yeah, I feel like the whole topic, well, that's the thing, like everybody uses, I guess that was the reason I brought it up, because everybody uses the term, and I was kind of curious on what your definition of it was, and was it the same for all cases? Because for me, like I am one of those people where I'm like, okay, if a kid's 16 or if a girl's 16 and the boyfriend's 18 or 19, I'm like, I kind of get it. Like mentally, they're kind of similar, or even if the gap's a tad more, like I can kind of see that. Like when I think about like the worst of the worst people, it really is like kids, like what we consider kids, and and like you said, like one thing we have to take in consideration, right, is that like you said, Ryan, every country is different, cultures are different, things that are acceptable in one culture isn't acceptable in another culture, and none of that means it's right or wrong. Like it doesn't cut and dry mean that it's right or wrong. I mean, look at like what was it, NAMBLA or whatever, like the North American boy
boy love association.
That's what I read about.
Like that's crazy. That's like a actual organization that like truly believes that it's okay, and they're not even saying like.
Well, I don't think they believe it's okay. I think they're trying to manufacture consent for what they want to do, and they want to normalize. I don't think they're like. No, actually, I don't think they genuinely believe this is good. You know what I mean? They use that same disingenuous argument of, the ancient Greeks had old men with teenage boys, and so they were such a learned society. Why can't we model ourselves after them and also have colosseums where slaves murder each other to death and all this stuff? Let's just bring it all back, right? I mean, it's just it's clearly a disingenuous argument where they're cherry picking points to try and justify something that is societally abnormal, and abnormal for a reason. It's about protecting the most vulnerable people in society, who are often, children, right?
Yeah.
The next generation, the future of a given society. And so we see in a lot of ways that not only, with COVID-19, right, we're seeing a lot of our freedoms and a lot of things about normal life being under attack. But, for several years, and like Ryan pointed out, the family's been targeted. Children have also been targeted, too. There's been, a lot of initiatives to try and redefine what it means to be a kid and give children, under a lot of cultural pressure from different sources, right? The power, they're saying, to make life-altering decisions like hormone treatment, for example, like an 8-year-old kid who's very susceptible to peer pressure, for example. I mean, that's a lot of power that could alter their life forever, that they're being given. And that sort of thing was unthinkable a few years ago, and they're saying it's all about tolerance and all of that. But there's a lot more to it than just that. At the end of the day, trying to treat these kids like they're adults, but only when it's convenient for them, and they can sort of, redefine a lot of this stuff to their benefit, right? So they're trying to redefine what is normal now, right? The new normal with COVID-19, redefine the nuclear family, redefine what it means to be a kid, and all of this stuff in a way that suits a specific agenda. It's not about redefining that for what really is in the common good, right? It goes far beyond that. And getting these, changing sex education too in the last couple of years, like in the UK, and also specifically in the UK, but also in places in the US where they're teaching really young kids about like masturbation and stuff, and that's not necessary. And like that, really pushing the envelope and saying it's about tolerance all day long. Well, the tolerance excuse can be abused very easily, and I would direct your attention to the South Park episode all about that if you want to see that explored to its logical extreme.
Yeah, well, like my kids will sometimes get confused because they're constantly putting, and there's nothing against them. But like it almost seems like there's a push, like you said, to put like cross-dressers on TV in commercials, transgender people, all the stuff, and then it's like you get in these awkward conversations where just like, wait, is that a boy or a girl? And I'm like, well, I guess we have to ask her or he.
Or stuff, that's fine, but like,
no,
I
don't have anything against that.
Center in kids' faces like it is now, and that's sort of happened in a way that really makes you question, like, why has this happened so quickly the past few years? At the same time, we're seeing this sort of push from those same people to sort of normalize stuff like with cuties and all of this stuff at the same time. It really, it should make us question what's really going on there. It's not to say, critics of this are like, oh, you're transphobic and all this stuff. I have my best friend in elementary school became, as a trans man. When I lived in the U.S., my roommate was trans. I know these people, people like that, and I know the struggles they had growing up, and I have a lot of empathy for what they suffered and their experiences, and I'm glad they feel a lot better now. But, trying to impose that on kids and saying, oh, you don't feel like you fit in, you don't feel normal, and telling them that that's why is not right. Because you're essentially hurting them to make them think, you're essentially putting it in their brain that this is the issue. Whereas people that are really like that know that's the issue, and they demonstrate that year after year, and then they make the decision at a certain point when they're capable of, okay, this is what I want to do with my life. But if you're putting the idea in someone's head, maybe they're socially isolated, or they have children at home, or they have problems at home, or they have low self-esteem for another reason. You're telling them the reason they feel bad is that, an adult is telling them that, or a TV show is telling them that, that is entirely separate. And it's not transphobic. It's just saying, that kid could enter into a decision they don't want to actually make, that they want to reverse later, and maybe they can't.
I think it's important too that we see that we all should recognize that just, homosexuality, being I don't know what the appropriate term now is, transsexual. I don't know what the allowable term is, but the point is that these things have always been misrepresented in the same way you could go back and argue that, black or white or any other minority has been, we see that these things have been badly treated, misrepresented in our history. So we're coming to a point now where people are overreacting in the other direction, and I think there's obvious political motivations there. But to your point about being in TV and stuff, I think the point is that it needs to be appropriately represented. Not like your point, Ricky, it is overwhelming. Every other character is either a gay person or a trans person. And that's not the actual representation of what the world is like, right? Right now, even in our politics, we see, I forget what the exact percentage is in the country, but it's a small percentage of people that are basically directing a large percentage of our policy right now, right? And that's not right no matter what discussion we're having, right? So we need to see that on what Whitney was talking about, what they're doing in schools is definitely wrong because the way they're going about it. They are pushing this in the minds of people that are at an age where they're wildly impressionable, and they're making decisions based on things that they have been driven into thinking is where they need to be going. And even if that is the direction they're going, we don't let children vote, drive, do any number of things until they're 18 or so on. And yet we're allowing them to decide that they're going to change their sex when they're barely able to understand what the world is going. I mean, it's obvious this isn't okay. But what we need
I think a lot of it. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you were on a roll. I kind of.
It's okay.
Sorry,
I just
the lag is brutal.
It's just ultimately make sure that we're allowing it to be, I hate even I was going to say equitable, but it's like not that word because that's everywhere today. But, that it's a fair, equal representation, and that politicians don't use this to abuse their agendas right in front of us because it's abusing children. I mean, this is a form of child abuse. That's what it is. Not to allow them to understand that it's there, but to push it into them and make them think that this is something they need to do now. I just read an article about an 8-year-old making that exact situation that Whitney was talking about and reeling back afterward, right? It's pretty scary. Go ahead.
Well, I think also that this, in my opinion, is part of this larger push that we're seeing in a lot of different ways right now to sort of rewrite the rules of biology. That's why we're seeing this push at a time when there's this massive push for gene editing to be the new norm, designer babies on all this stuff. We're seeing it also now with COVID-19 for healthcare applications and all of this stuff, and also crop protection. DARPA says, right? But gene editing research has really gotten to a point where it's much more intense and powerful, and it is ripe for misuse in a way it never has been before. And sort of making this whole thing, oh, you can choose your gender when you're a kid and all this stuff, is sort of like, well, you can remake your biology, and you can do that with gene editing, or you can do that with nanotechnology and machines. I think, in my opinion, it's part of, the foundation of sort of normalizing this view of, well, we're like human technology, our technology is better than nature, and we can use our technology to rewrite everything. So you want to change this and this and this about yourself? Well, now you can, right? And sort of just flying in the face of nature, thinking that, with this arrogance that human-built technology and synthetic means and AI can do what nature created much better, right? Which I think will ultimately fall in our, backfire spectacularly, at some point down the line. But I think it's all part of the same agenda at the end of the day. It sort of feeds into that same end.
Yeah, it's I mean, you guys have tattoos. You ever meet somebody who has a really crappy tattoo, and then they're like, "Oh, I got it when I was 18." We make poor decisions when we're young. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, but there's also cover-up tattoos that you can get.
Yeah, but my point is, like, this idea of like letting a little kid make permanent decisions, like hormone replacement, like, turn into another gender at such a young age, when, like, how many of us look at pictures of us in middle school or grade school and like, I can't believe I wore that, or I can't believe I went through that phase. Like, but we can always change the way we dress. We can always, like you said, cover up a tattoo. You can't, like, those long-term health issues that you might have from the hormones. I mean, that's going to be with you forever. You might never be the person you were before.
Or you may be infertile.
Yeah. So it's like, why not let people, like, if you want to turn into whatever, I mean, if you want to turn into a tree, whatever it is, like, I don't care what people do. I'm very libertarian when it comes down to, like, dude, do whatever makes you happy. I don't care if you want to smoke weed every day, if you want to whatever, if you want to sit around lounge, like, whatever you want to do, like, do it, whatever makes you happy. Like, life's too short. Like, if it makes you happy, then do whatever. But I think people, like you said, parents who, I think in some cases, and I know some in even my personal life, people that I know who I feel like they want to do the right thing in regards to, like, I just want to support them with whatever decisions they make. But like you said, they have all these outside influences of TV, media saying, like, hey, I think I might be, I might be this or I might be that. And it's like, as a parent, you just want to be supportive, and you're like, okay, well, let's do it. If you want to do this, whatever you want to do. And it's like, I'm for that, being supportive, but it's like, hey, let's not make any permanent decisions until you're a little older, and then you decide, like, yeah, no, this is still me. I remember there's this,
at least like several years, at least the people I knew, growing up in my own personal life that fit in this category, it was something they demonstrated from a young age, but continued for like a decade after, it first popped up, right? As opposed to, someone thinking for 3 months they are, and then they waffle, and that's not really why. I mean, there's a lot of different factors that go into it, but I mean, the person I grew up with, who was my best friend in elementary school, really suffered because of what they felt inside, right? Right. And that was before this push to normalize it. There was really something there that didn't get fixed until there was a change made.
And that's an interesting point there. Sorry, go ahead.
No, well, I was just going to say that, like, the way it's being set up now is like there isn't a period. Not that I'm saying that like everyone needs to suffer like this person I knew did, right? Because I mean, obviously, it was really difficult what they went through. But I mean, the way to normalize it and make it so easy that, like, okay, you decide this week, you start thinking that's what it is, and then you just, it all opens up for you. There's no resistance to see if that really is what you're feeling. Just because of how messed up and sick society and culture is right now, so many people have poor self-esteem or feel bad about their bodies or feel bad about themselves, and it can be for a wide variety of reasons. And this is especially true, you know, for preteens and kids who may get bullied at school. Someone makes fun of their nose, and then, oh, you know, can I get a nose job, you know, when they're 8, and then it's permanent, right? And then you can't reverse it. I mean, this is kind of a similar thing. Would you allow an 8-year-old to decide what sort of plastic surgery they want? They want, you know, big boobs at 8, and they want to like a nose job. I mean, would that be societally acceptable? I mean, this is a similar large surgical or hormonal intervention that creates long-lasting changes that's sort of being treated like, oh, you know, yeah, you want it, the day, you know, just go for it. I think it sort of complicates and muddies the real issue. But, you know, what they're doing here is they're exploiting people that want to be tolerant and compassionate of people who are different, because there are people like this, and it is important to be compassionate and understanding about it. But, you know, not just in this issue, but in numerous issues, there are predatory forces exploiting that goodness in people for their own ends. Our desire to tolerate, you know, differences of others, are wanting to be compassionate and empathetic to people. The people that plan a lot of this stuff out, you know, are sociopaths. They don't think like that, and they see that as a weakness in people like us, and so they exploit it. So it's really important to talk about all these different dimensions of these issues. And when there are, you know, in the US today, when there is a dialogue about this issue, you're not allowed to talk about these dimensions or explore the complexity of the issue and things like that. And that ultimately does a disservice to what's going on. And I honestly, you know, I think at the end of the day, it's going to end up hurting actually people that are actually trans by sort of cheapening their experience and also vilifying it at some point down the line, when there are a bunch of kids that did get sort of herded into this and then they decide to reverse or whatever. I mean, people could point at that and be like, this isn't real, when there are people who actually do experience this, right?
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't be lessening the experience like that. That's kind of what I was hinting. The idea before is that but before all of this push, there were clearly people that were going through this, that did suffer, that were confused about who they really were because we didn't understand it as a society or so on, right? That's a real plight that we need to respect there. But like you said, it's being overcompensated in the other direction where they're using it politically. And I think that the other aspect to this in schools, which you also kind of touched on, is that it's a trendy thing. Like, this has become a trendy discussion, a trendy direction that people want to do it because they think it makes them cool. We've all been there when we were kids. Like you said, nose job, or wear something you regret wearing when you were a kid. That's happening now, where kids are thinking, well, you know, like they think I'm outside of their circle, like I'm a, you know, cis white male that's just not cool enough and not suppressed enough to be part of your circle. Well, suddenly I'm going to change that, you know, and that is a real aspect. I'm not suggesting all of them or what percentage, but that exists, and that's dangerous. And to what Ricky said, I think it's important. Again, I think all of us agree that I don't care what you want to do with your life, what you want to call yourself, anything. I'm completely okay with any of that. Whether it's okay with me shouldn't even matter to you. But at the end of the day, it matters to me if you're forcing me to act a different way. If I have to say something or call you something that I may not agree with, that's the moment that line is crossed, there's an issue there. And it's not about what they are, what they're becoming, or what they want to be. It's because you're infringing on my ability to act and think for myself. Right? Those are two very different things that get blended together. I'm not transphobic because I don't want you to tell me how to think, you know, while I'm sitting here going, feel free, do whatever you want. Right? It's confusing.
Yeah, and the thing is, too, is like I've had the benefit of having a boy and a girl, and they're drastically different. I mean, I do the same things with both of them. My daughter, she's younger, so she likes to tag along with my son and I if we're playing soccer or whatever. My son can play sports all day and never gets tired of it. My daughter will do it for like a second to tag along, and then 2 seconds later is like, no, I'm good. You know, she's like more into, you know, and it's not that people are different, but my point is like, you know, there has been studies where they put toys in front of kids, because everybody likes to believe everything's a social construct, right? Like everything has to do with like, oh, society tells you that women should look like this or be better at that. I mean, a lot of it's it's our survival, you know, years and years of surviving has led us down these paths where like men, you know, they say men are a little better with directions. And I'm sure there's some women who are like, you haven't met my husband. And, but that men are better with direction because they would have to go hunt and then find a way back to the tribe. Women are better with like colors or whatnot because they would be picking the fruit and whatnot, things like that. So there is they also say why women like to, I guess, I'm going to piss off some women, gossip or whatever, is because for survival reasons you almost had to be secretive. Like Whitney said, in throughout history, women would be stoned if they didn't follow the rules of the male or found out that they were cheating or whatever. So some of this has to do with survival mechanisms, like deep rooted in our DNA. But the other thing too is like I don't see anything wrong with like if a girl likes what we consider traditionally boy stuff, we just used to call him a tom girl. Like she was a girl. It didn't mean she had to like surgically, put a penis on her. Like, it's just like, she was just a tom boy. So I think now there is a little bit more pressure where just like, oh, if I like boy stuff, does that mean that I should do this and I should do that? And you hear cases like
it's created a new cultural norm where like people are asking those questions they didn't ask before and considering very far surgical means with far-reaching consequences to respond to something that was recently inserted into that internal dialogue of a person.
And you're seeing groups of girls like Ryan talked about, and I've heard cases of this where like a group of friends will decide that, hey, we should all do this together. And the experts will say, like, statistically, that's impossible for all you to a big group of girls like that.
It's a peer pressure thing. I mean, kids are really susceptible to that. They just want to feel like they belong. They want to be accepted. They want to be cool. Okay, so what if your kid is in a school where it's cool to be that, and then they're going to do these things, modify their body in a way that will affect them for the rest of their lives just because they want to fit in? Like I said, it's really like cheapening the very real experience that people that are actually trans have, and it's in pursuit, I would argue, of this farther-reaching agenda of normalizing the use of technology or medicine or whatever to totally upend and remake biology. And just normalize like, oh, you can change anything about your body or your biology you don't like this, whether now it's gender. I mean, they're going to move it along to anything. I mean, that's where this whole gene editing medicine and the transhumanist agenda of, oh, you can increase your cognitive abilities, or you can wear an exoskeleton, or you can do this or that, or you can have like these contact lenses that do this in your eye, whatever. They're trying. It's all part, in my opinion, of the same push, because as soon as this started to pop on the scene, we started to see all of these other elements sort of folded into that, and that's, in my opinion, seems to be sort of this agenda that keeps marching on, including the transhumanist thing. I don't know. I mean, it's this whole, I think transhumanism only really exists because there's a lot of the people that are transhumanists, I think, have that sort of dysphoria about their own bodies and their own experiences, and they see it as a way, technology is the only way to ameliorate that in themselves, as opposed to looking for other means or being okay with how they are or whatever, and are sort of looking to technology to be the savior for whatever they feel is wrong about themselves, because they're essentially saying our bodies are inferior, and now we're being conditioned through COVID-19 to be fearful of our own bodies and our own biology and look to technology or social distancing, new norms, and all of this stuff to protect us against, a biology that's, developed over centuries and millennia and has been fine. And here is humankind still. We didn't need masks for all the plagues of past days. We're still here. Do we really need to become bubble people? I think it's all sort of, it's really hard to separate it all and look, because a lot of it, a lot of this stuff ends up interconnecting at the end of the day.
That's a really interesting crossover to think about right there. This previous agenda, if you will, that is within that of the push to normalize this or push into people's minds, and for instance, the Black Mirror episode in regard to, I mean, you literally could make that episode about transgender ideas, and it's the exact same thing. But it was an episode, I don't know if you saw it, about where it was that.
I don't watch TV, so.
Right. Well, this is horrifying. I mean, I watched one series of that show, and I was like, I'm never watching this stuff again. It's crazy.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
in this episode, it was that, but with girls doing that stuff in regard to transhumanism. Like adding a chip in their brain or adding eye things or things on their hands where they can scan things. And it's the same idea. And she was pressured into it. And her friend told her to do it. And I mean, it was an analogy for the trans idea. I mean, but really tying in that idea, I think that's really spot on, Whitney. That's an interesting tie-in because all of it is now like you're normalizing the idea of manipulating your body to kind of coalesce with the rest of society, and that's kind of what that's going.
Too, right? It's all of nature. We have to gene edit all the crops that we eat, and we have to protect them, and we have to, spray this whatever Bill Gates, I forget what it was. He wanted to spray stuff in the stratosphere to protect the planet and all of this stuff, right? It's sort of it's not just the human body anymore, right? It's expanding to the environment, and I think it's really unfortunate. That all of this stuff is happening. And that's why it's really important occasionally, like we've been doing right now, sort of to talk about the holistic big picture for this, because it's really easy to focus on the isolated parts. But really what we're seeing in a big way is a war against human society and also just like nature in general, right? And I think, it... Mm-hmm.
No, I was just gonna say, it's the nature, because I agree with you. I think that there is something about like blurring that line between like organic and synthetic, right? Like it's like we're gonna get to the point where just like we're not gonna know what natural is or whatnot. But then I've heard the argument.
That is so sad.
But
I mean, that is just what an awful world.
Because I want to continue just bringing up controversial things and going down weird rabbit holes. So I've heard the argument, and it kind of makes sense, and I'd like to your guys' take on it. Like the idea of like, okay, well, if we're a part of the natural world and we create something the same way that like bees will create a hive or whatever, then wouldn't like how do you consider it not natural? You like where do you draw the line? Like if something is just, I mean, it's obviously created by man, we're a part of the natural world, then shouldn't that thing also be considered natural? Because it's like, how do you consider something not natural? Like where do you draw the line between, a man-made thing and then something that's made by nature, but nature also is having an influence on things, and we're having an influence on things.
Right. So like the hive mind thing with bees, though, but like humans aren't bees, you know what I mean? So like to say like, okay, humans need to be like bees. I mean, is that the argument?
I was just no, it's not that. I guess I'm just trying to make the point that like the same way that like things in the world have evolved, and I guess I'm trying to prevent from using the word naturally evolved.
Okay,
you get what I'm saying? So humans are.
What you're saying. Okay, so like the transhumanist argument is like human evolution has stopped because of how society is developed, and the way to continue evolution and to continue human progress is to merge with machines that we have created, because we will continue and speed up and improve the evolutionary process. That's how these people think. And they think this way, in my opinion, and I don't want to get too hippy-dippy on people. I think it's because these people are entirely divorced from any sort of spirituality entirely, and they see the world through this hard material, Richard Dawkins style perspective of humans are just animals, and this is all about evolutionary biology, and there's no sort of that's what we can observe with science as it exists now is all there is type of thing, right? And so there's no room in that world for, well, maybe humans are still evolving in the way that things are playing out, and the way nature is set up and moves and develops is great and amazing. They don't view it that way. They have sort of this dystopian view of what nature is, because they've had bad experiences with it for whatever reason, or like we were, I sort of touched on a little bit earlier. So I think they have this sort of worldview where the only way for humans to continue to advance is merge with machines, and I think they think that because they don't, they're so disconnected from nature and from just what life is. At its core, however you want to define that, I'll leave that up to people. right? But I mean, they're interested in them taking control. They view themselves as the pinnacle of creation, right? And like, we know what's best. I mean, this is how the elite, often think, the sort of elitist thing, we know what's best. And it's sort of this arrogance of, what we will build will be better than what exists now and all of this stuff. So.
Well, I might have misheard your question, but what defines it? Is that what you were saying? Like what's the difference?
Well,
I mean, for me,
well, no, I'm not saying so this, I was just putting it out there because I've heard people make the argument that if everything that's on this earth is natural, then if we created it, then shouldn't that be also considered natural, right? Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's very, very clear. Personally, I mean, there's an obvious line, and I think we're trying to blend this as well, which Whitney's clearly pointing out there that this is just kind of, they're making that the natural evolution, which is just ridiculous, right? I think it's an obvious line where, I mean, I think it comes down to symbiosis, right? I mean, before the technological drive, the industrial revolution, people were to a larger degree more symbiotic with their environment, right? I mean, that's how life is supposed to be. And the further we get away from that, the more we're disrupting the way the world is reacting. And that's why we're seeing pollution and death and industrial disease. And so I think at the end of the day, the moment that we deviate from that natural idea, it's an immediate, I mean, and that's not to say it's right or wrong, but that becomes synthetic in any sense, right? You're taking when you're growing something is the best way to look at it, right? If you're just taking a seed and you're planting it into the ground and letting it grow on its own, or using natural things around you to help or whatever with that, that's organic. The moment you add something that was created by man in a way to help that thing, that becomes synthetic. It becomes no longer organic. But then there's the line about where and to what degree you consider it synthetic. But, I think it's pretty easy to define.
Well, the other thing that people have to take in consideration when having this conversation is that humans are very adaptable, but throughout history, like when new technologies have come about, like, TV, radio, whatever it may be, these are slow transitions. And it's usually like this one thing that we have to kind of adapt to, or we learn to accept into our lives and our cultures. But processing power has like grown quicker than anything that we've ever known before. So like the technology, like, I think, my personal views are that technology is just, even if we could some way adapt to, like, social media and technology and all, not have it consume our lives like the way we do now. I mean, one, obviously there a lot of these the software and algorithms is used for manipulation and getting us to think a certain way or see certain things and not see certain things. But also, even if you take that aside, I just don't think we can adapt as quickly as things are evolving. I mean, technology is evolving at such a rate that humans just aren't adaptable to it. And like Whitney was saying, a lot of these people who are, and I don't want to get all hippy dippy either, because I was raised a Catholic. I became a atheist for a long time, and then I realized, like, I left a team just to join another team. Like, these guys are just as tribal as the other tribe. And
I feel that way.
And yeah, right. And so I'm still I'm not, I don't like using the word atheist. I'm not, I don't subscribe to any specific religious view, organized religion, but I see the benefits in it. I see the benefits in believing there's more to the world than just the material things that we can perceive and understand based on our limited senses. Like, to me, like, seeing beyond that is what helps somebody become a better human, and what helps somebody, instead of just being like, super capitalistic where everything's about making maximum profit and this and that. Like, I know people who need to go to church, because it the priest might tell them, like, hey, think about the afterlife, think about, sinning, think about being a better person. Like, some people don't need that. Like, some of us are good at self-reflecting and, maybe looking at our moral compass and thinking, like, okay, is this really the right thing to do or not to do? But some people don't. They get stuck in the motions, and they need maybe, that Sunday day, morning at church to kind of help them kind of pump the brakes and think about these bigger things, these questions that I think are bigger than just, like Whitney said, these material things that are really pointless.
See, you made a good, interesting point there in regard to the moral compass. And this is where I think people tend to put this this discussion, that I think spirituality, whether you want to call that religion or anything else, like, I'm with you. I'm very anti-organized religion for reasons I won't get into, personal, but I have a very spiritual relationship with God. I'm a Christian. It's just different than what you would expect from organized religion. And I think the difference there is that is an aspect, whether it, again, religion or spirituality, however, that is necessary for what we are as individuals. That's just my personal opinion. But I think when we bring it into this idea that going to church is about learning to be moral, I've always had a disagreement with that. I feel like we're innately, as human beings, we know what's right and wrong. I think when you go out and you strike somebody, you intrinsically know that that's not okay, right? I mean, you may even, there's a whole conversation there. But I think what we need to see, in my opinion, is that this kind of this next level, like feeling that there's more to the world, that there's more power behind things than we can define, is really a huge part of who we are. And I think that has to be seen as independent from learning what's right and wrong.
Right. Really quick, I want to go back to some of the stuff I was talking about earlier, because I sort of had time to develop it a little more in my head. But I think a lot of this goes back to the fact that for a long time, society, Western society specifically, but post-industrial revolution society in general, just has a really dysfunctional relationship with nature. You look at a lot of, like Protestant Calvinist Christianity, for example, that was really influential politically for a very long time. There's a lot of themes about we need to dominate nature. Also the stuff going on in the 1800s in the U.S. about manifest destiny. We have to, it wasn't just conquering the savages, with, Native Americans, all of that. It was also the savage wilderness. Nature was viewed in that way, that it needs to be, you have to demolish the forest and put whatever, and that's civilizing, society, and all of this, viewing us as separate from nature and as nature as something to be dominated and controlled by man. I think that that mindset, which has been around for centuries, this transhumanist push and this push to edit and ultimately change and alter biology through technological means, is the logical consequence of following that ideology through the ages, because it's the same ultimate idea. We have nature, it's based on the same assumptions. Nature is bad, it's dangerous, and it needs to be controlled, and we need to dominate it. Us as people need to dominate it, while at the same time, that mindset is hugely flawed, because it ignores the fact that we are part of nature and there is a connection there. And a lot of the dysphoria that, transhumanist proponents and all of this stuff feel about all of this, I would argue, is because of that lack of connection with nature and that lack of belonging that, existed there historically for mankind and in society, and that nature in a lot of, religions, historically, indigenous religions, whatever, was such a central part of life. And now we have essentially divided it. And if you look at how society in the U.S. has been set up for decades and decades and decades, and really most of this century, I mean, a trend you can see over time is increased separation between humans and nature, keeping nature at bay. Just look at the food supply, for example. I mean, everything, people used to have gardens, grow food, interact with plants, and now everything comes like shrink wrapped in a grocery store with labels and all of this stuff, right? It's very different than the way things used to be before. And so, they're looking at, nature through this mindset as biology, nature, whatever, as something that needs to be manipulated and controlled by man, assuming that man and nature are separate. And that is where I think a lot of this ultimately comes from. So I think an antidote to that, and you see this, popping up in countries around the world, including the US and in the West, and like Chile, where I live, a lot of people that are trying to get back to that, to seeing us as part of nature and going back to a much healthier paradigm about what that is, right? And that doesn't necessitate being part of organized religion either, but seeing yourself as part of a whole that's existed on the planet since there's been life here, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think, and the more we stray away from what we would consider natural or organic, the more I think there's a need for it, and we realize there's a need for it. There's a lot of things we take for granted. Like I'm big into cigars, and I like whiskey, I like wine, and I like all these things. And it's not
That's
just
okay.
I'm a big bourbon guy, but it's not just because the getting the buzz or whatever it may be, you know, the nicotine buzz or alcohol buzz, whatever. It's because of you're paying attention to things that you usually neglect a lot, like your senses, taste, smells, all that stuff, which is same thing with food, right? Like, you know, it's similar thing where it just all day you don't even pay attention to smells and tastes or whatever. And then you sit down, you have a nice meal and you're paying attention to those things and appreciating them. And you're starting to see a trend of like younger and younger people getting into like IPAs and wines and cigars and whiskeys and all this stuff. And I think it's because like, you know, when that was our pleasure, you know, and we did, you know, and it kind of, or the further we get away from enjoying those things, the more we realize like, oh shit, that was like, this is really fun. And there's a communal thing to it too, because I get together with friends, we smoke cigars, we're all together. Like I have friends that are Muslim. They, not that, I mean, it's not only Muslims, but Middle Eastern culture with the hookah thing. Like one thing I've always liked about hookah is that it forces everybody to be around the hookah bong, because because so it forces you to have to, instead of me like watching a game or me being on my phone or, you know, whatever, or music blaring and not being able to conversate, like it forces everybody to sit around this one hookah, and we have to, you know, in many cases we share it, you know, and we talk about what we're smoking, do we like it, you know. And I think that's the thing that is really important with all these things. Like my father's, he's made wine my whole life. My grandparents did, my great-grandparents did. And one thing that I miss about like living at home was during that winemaking season when everybody was at the house, everybody's helping, everybody's, you know, drinking and talking and snacking while they're helping. And it's like, it wasn't just about the wine itself. It was about the whole event, the whole celebration of it. And I have Muslim friends that are not really strict Muslims at all, but they still do Ramadans. And the reason they do it is like, it's like, I do it because I like the celebration at the end of the night. You know, when we finally eat, we're all together, the families get together, you know? So I think, you know, this whole, like, you know, we call it social media, like it was supposed to make us more social and connect us more. I think people are realizing like the complete opposite is happening.
About it, how it actually like negatively affects people emotionally and makes people feel more isolated and more disconnected. And I think it's no coincidence that a lot of these social media companies, you know, have deep ties to, well, you know, they're Silicon Valley companies. Essentially, they all have deep ties to the state, or to intelligence, or to other things like that have, you know, a vested interest in people being feeling divided and isolated and fearful and negative, because people in those states are ultimately easier to control, right? So it's also had a major effect, I would argue, on the political power of regular people, because instead of going to the streets or going directly to, you know, politicians' faces and telling them we're not going to take it, we just go and we scream in our virtual corrals, you know, in Twitter and Facebook, and yell in there, and we get all the anger out, right? We vent, so we feel better, but we're not actually affecting much change that way, in terms of as a collective, right? Whereas, you know, if social media didn't exist and people went down to City Hall and everyone was like, what the fuck? You know, well, then maybe something would happen. But if, you know, everyone in town tweets, you know, what the fuck? I mean, the City Hall will just be like, mute. You know?
Well, I mean,
it's definitely different.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I like when I have people on, I like going down some weird rabbit holes and have these discussions, because I mean, that's where you learn, and you never know, like, if your perspective or your opinion, like you've joined a tribe and unknowingly haven't explored other ideas or perspectives. And that's why, like, I'm always so willing to just talk about everything and anything, because I'm curious. I'm a curious person. But when you bring people together, that's what happens. People share ideas, people share perspectives. When you isolate them, you can convince yourself of anything. I mean, it's like, you know, you put me in a cabin by myself long enough, I can convince myself that I've been lied about the sky, and the sky's really purple, and purple's really blue, and blue's, you know, like, you can convince yourself of anything. I mean, you see these people who are put alone in long periods of time in prison, like, they go insane. Like, you need conversation to share ideas, challenge ideas. And yeah, so I mean, a lot of this stuff, like the suburbs, this idea of like the suburbs, and like that the ideal place to live would be somewhere where you have privacy and you don't know your neighbors and nobody talks to one another, and you're dependent on, you know, having to go to a grocery store because your neighbor and you don't know each other, but he might grow, tomatoes, you might grow cucumbers, you could trade. I live in a little Portuguese community. If my lawnmower breaks, like usually somebody's paying attention and they'll be like, hey, you want to borrow my like there's a community. We know each other. If something happens, we look after one another. And so this idea, like, it's like what was it, George Carlin, who said they call it the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe that it's real or something like that. It's that's this idea of like the American dream of having the white picket fence and having all this privacy and living in the suburb. Like, it's really a fucking nightmare, and it creates the country that we live in where in many cases, like, depression is high, self-medication is high with pills or alcohol or whatever, and anxiety is high, all this stuff. And people need purpose. People need community. That's why like this whole lockdown thing, like one of the things that pissed me off the most was that aspect of it, where you're preventing people from at least having one another. Like, I know people, like, I remember one time my wife was Zooming with some family, and she's like, hey, look, we're all on Zoom. Your whole family's on it. And I looked at her and I'm like, they live right there. Why the fuck are we Zooming? Like this is ridiculous. Like, we all live in the same neighborhood. Why? Like, and I was so upset because I'm like, we are all giving in to this idea, like, we can't get together. We can't even, I would go for walks and people would stop in their car and they wouldn't roll their window all the way down. And I'm like, come on, really? Like, it really was a great way of like, you didn't have anybody to bounce ideas off and really come to the realization that, like, none of this was making sense, or at least much of it wasn't making sense. So all you had was mainstream media force feeding you. Like, now it's just like everybody's talking about cases. Nobody's asking the question, like, why? Like, nobody's dying. Why are we so afraid of it? Like,
that's what they've done. They've moved it all to all the statistics they talk about now. It's just the number of positive tests, even though even the New York Times like had a whole full-length article talking about how PCR tests are notorious for false positives, right? So, but they're not talking more about like hospitalizations, the death count. It's all about the number of positive cases. That's true in the UK too. And the UK, in justifying, the new lockdowns they're pushing for, they show this chart, right, of cases, and it looks like a huge second wave based on the number of positive cases. But you compare that by the same government data, the same graph put out by the same UK government agency, it's deaths, and there's like no deaths. There's no other wave, right? So, using that graph wouldn't justify the policy they want, but the number of positive cases would. And then it comes out, right, that 80% of the people that tested positive in the UK had no symptoms of anything at all, and all this stuff, and they're justifying these policies. I mean, James Corbett did a really good documentary a year or two ago just about how easy it is to game science and statistics and clinical trials and whatever to support a predetermined outcome. Academia has been corrupted for decades and decades by government funding that has an agenda. And not necessarily all like NSF or NIH funded studies are like that, but there definitely are some that are like that. But also corporate money. You have like scientists that are in agriculture, for example, paid off by Monsanto or Bayer or Cargill, that they're funded. Their labs are funded by them, and they do research that supports whatever those guys want and supports their products, the ability for them to sell their products and all and things like that. I mean, it's all.
Yeah, it was called The Crisis of Science was the name of it was a really good video. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I highly recommend everybody watching it, because it really, again, this goes back to like how we think scientists are this like beyond.
Well, it's making them the new gods now, right?
Yeah,
is essentially what a lot of this stuff with COVID-19 has been about. Oh, the people we must listen to, basically going to making like a church around science, essentially. Like, oh, Fauci, he is the all-knowing disease guy. I mean, it's just it's silly to do that when you consider the stuff like Corbett lays out in that documentary about how easily that has been manipulated, but also how limited science is as it exists now, and using that as the basis for, the future of the world and all. Like, as an example, we know like hardly anything about our own oceans in terms of biology. Like, science is like not studied so much about the oceans, that we know more about space than we do about our own oceans and things like that, right? I mean, there is so much that science does not know, and so much that science cannot explain, and so many lots of theories, scientific theories that are later proven to be wrong, or revised, and all of this stuff. And treating it, as a new religion, like you were talking earlier, Ricky, about like atheism, you're sort of trading one for the other. And so, there's this push to make like state science the new religion in a lot of ways. Over the course of the year, it's a very slippery slope where we're not allowed to talk about the conflicts of interest of that science, how science is manipulated by bad actors, how it can be manipulated, and all. Like Ryan a lot on his show has covered this double standard about ignoring certain scientific studies that don't go with the narrative, and then promoting ones that do, even if the science in one is better than the other. I mean, that's irrelevant to these people. It's all about, cherry picking the evidence and saying, oh, it's science, to justify a political agenda that isn't based on science. It's based on this other agenda that we've been talking about.
It comes down to the idea that actual science is always questionable. Not in the sense that the idea should be able to be questioned. The idea is that science is always evolving and we're always learning more. So in this weird, spin on it, we're telling ourselves that no, now it's settled and we can't ask questions. And it's interesting to think about, before I even touch on the PCR test, is that grants and the way that this stuff is funded today, and I think a lot of people have covered this, it's very apparent how this has been politicized. The scientists need to get published in order to have their careers evolve. They get published by getting certain things accepted by groups that have already been politicized. So then they get them. So they basically have to play the games with their words to get them to be accepted. So they know that there's certain things that will just get ignored, right? And even the Lancet, their mask, this big old thing they did about masks, is being attacked by all kinds of reputable people saying, look, there are mistakes, there are false equivalencies, you need to redact, just pull it back entirely. And that's the one everyone's pointing to. And the point, if that can get approved by something like the Lancet, it shows you that there's obviously politics involved. And the PCR test aspect, I mean, aside from all of that and everything we've already mentioned, we have pre-existing information about these things that goes back long before we got here. People that use these things in regard to testing genetic material in muscles. And I've referenced this guy more than once, and he's been outspoken about this. He came out right in the beginning and said, look, there's communities like ours, or scientific communities, that have used these tests for years, and we are well aware of the huge false positive. There's still a use for us. We still use it, but it should not be applied in a sense like this, obviously. And why would that guy why would he get ignored? Right? I mean, there's so many things like this. And as she pointed out, the New York Times did the study, which is now being even more confirmed. I'm seeing things on global research that are putting that about 84 to 90-something% false positive rates. You even have the mainstream media openly discussing how the false negative rate could mean that there's more, without addressing the obvious alternative to that point, that there's obviously also a false positive rate. It's just a joke that they're covering and hiding this. And I think this obviously goes back to the real point of the PCR idea, that it has not been isolated, as Whitney mentioned before. This is a fact, right? They didn't apply, they had Koch's postulates, which is the gold standard. They tried, it didn't work, so they just altered the way that they did it. Dr. Kaufman's talked about this, a lot of people have, and they'll admit it when pressed. They just argue that they did what they all decided was the right thing after the gold standard didn't work to prove that existed. So what are they basing the vaccine on? What are they testing for at the PCR test? They're testing it on genetic material that was taken from someone's lungs in China way back when this all began, that they then just have, they've just been using since then. And this is a group that our country is accusing of lying to us about everything. So how in the world does that even make sense? Right? There's so many issues in there that they just don't want to address.
Right.
Yeah. I think we hit on so many topics. This is the nice thing about the show. I don't know what the hell we're going to talk about sometimes. When James Corbett used to come on the show at the early days, he used to ask me, because he varies, he hits so many different topics in his research that sometimes I think he just wanted kind of rough idea of what I might bring up, and so I'd give him a list of hey, I think I'm going to talk about this, maybe discuss this with you or whatever. And at the end of the show, I always found myself apologizing for not talking about any of the things I told we were going to talk about, but I guess that's what makes it fun. But
I love
thanks,
going
guys.
on shows like that. I like not knowing what we're going to get into. It's fun.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people ask me, but I'm like, don't hold me to this. I'm like, this is what we might discuss. But it's what makes it fun. It's why I enjoy it, and to be able to sit down with other people that I really respect and just be able to kind of pick at your brains and get your perspectives on stuff. I mean, it's a journey. Like I always tell the listeners, I'm like, it's a journey for the listeners, but it's also a journey for myself. Like I'm learning and I'm evolving my opinions and perspectives while I'm having these discussions. So it really is like a journey where we're kind of all going on together. And I think it's one of the benefits of long form conversations. You guys do it all the time on your shows. And I think you can really put out your ideas, and when you have time to kind of try to verbalize your ideas, sometimes you think about stuff and you realize when you try to verbalize, like, okay, well, it wasn't as well thought out as I thought it was, so I think there's a lot of benefit in all this. So but thanks again, guys, for always taking time to come on. I really, really appreciate it. We are doing another, I know Ryan will probably be asleep, but we are doing another Union of the Unwanted at 7 p.m. Eastern time, Monday. If either, I'll send you guys a Zoom link. Like I always tell you guys, if you can drop in. If you can't, then hopefully on a future show, you'll be able to join us. And thanks, guys. Keep up the super important work. I'm sure we pissed off some people about talking about a lot of stuff that they didn't.
Well, the hot button issues need to be discussed in a way that's civil and intelligent, right? And explore the complexity of those issues, because they're hot button issues, because there's like no civil discourse in the U.S. anymore. Like, it's really hard to have like a civil conversation about contentious issues, and it shouldn't be that way. So it's really important to try and do that in a way that's like, where everyone's trying to, not come in with an agenda and just like talk it out, right? Hopefully that's an example for some people, because a lot of the divisions they're trying to provoke in us, right now can be ameliorated through that type of discourse. And that's why they're, trying to this whole triggered thing, right? Trying to keep people away from discussing things out and understanding the other perspective and reaching a middle ground. I mean, that's how that's supposed to work. But if everyone's like, oh, I hate you, right from the get-go, just because you mentioned this one thing, I'm not going to let you explain because I'm mad, I mean, that's just like not a healthy way to approach discourse. So hopefully, I think it's important to discuss this stuff. A lot of my work revolves around trying to appeal, just talk about the facts and try to appeal to the widest base possible, people on the left and the right or whatever of a variety of opinions. And I think it's important to try and, especially given where we are now as a country, trying to branch out a little more, talk about more things and show that like a lot of these hot button issues, I mean, we shouldn't be afraid of talking it out. Talking it out is the way we resolve things, right? So, I think it's important. So, it's a nice change of pace.
If I might compliment Whitney in the end here as well, one of the things I love about her work is that it's funny because we just talked about this for somebody's comment, that she doesn't try to force her opinions into people. She's not saying, and here's what this means, and this is what you should think. It's the same idea with the show, is that we're saying, here's the information, and here's some connections that we've made, but think about it. Think about what that may mean. And we're not going to just lay it out for you if we, unless it's something that's a certainty. That's critical so rare today. What's that?
No, critical thinking. Please use it, people.
It just really is rare today. And it's just that's the kind of thing that we're trying to do here, is make, allow people to come to their own conclusions.
Yeah. And like you said, be an example that you don't have to agree with everybody on everything all the time. Yeah. And you can have those discussions. Like I always say, I think it was a great creative tactic how we tell people you can't talk about religion or politics, but you can argue all day about sports. Like I see people fight about sports all day. So the stuff that's not important, like, that's the stuff you can get, you can spark those conversations all day. Not a big deal. Nobody's going to get mad at you if you get in a heated argument about sports. But if you bring up politics or religion, it's like what we should really be saying is like, let's learn how to have discussions. Let's not avoid them. Avoiding them is, that's, the definition of ignorance is saying, I'm not going to take in any new information. I'm not going to look at any more information. This is where I stand regardless of anything else. And it's like, that's ignorant. So it's like, to me, the important conversations are the ones you should be having. And of course, there's always a chance of, when you're talking about stuff like vaccines or religion or anything that's controversial, there's always a chance of somebody getting defensive or angry. But, we should work on that. And just like anything, if you practice it and you work on it and you learn how to like maybe handle it differently, we can get better at doing those things. But, I think straying away from those conversations are the worst thing we can do.
Well, yeah, I mean, there needs to be people in the U.S. need to be, not everyone, right, but just in general, our discourse requires that we emotionally mature as a society, because right now a lot of the discourse is very emotionally immature, and, people are shying away or choosing not to discuss contentious topics because people, I think a lot of it can be boiled down to a maturity issue, How do we talk about things that are difficult for us? How can we try and be objective in information that, stresses us out, and issues that stress us out? I mean, we really, as a nation need to start, as a people, whatever, need to start like self-reflecting and think about how we can improve things, because things are bad and things will get worse until we do that important, like, internal work as a collective. Right? Like, we need to be able to understand the other person that may disagree with us on these hot button issues isn't an evil person, right? We have to try and work things out, or, we're screwed. And I think most people, we're getting to such a breaking point that it's getting to a point where people don't want to see the whole country burn down. They would rather, at this point, even if it's hard, reach across the aisle and try and, work things out like adults. And I'm really hoping that's where things will go. But of course, it remains to be seen. I don't want to be too optimistic, right?
Well, if I could bring us back to the beginning thing you started with, Ricky, to kind of wrap it up here, I think that we talked about the lack of the family unit, the what this is all doing and how it's pulling us away from all this. And it's interesting to think about that exact same kind of thing. That's exactly what we need to be breaking through and trying to do, right? I mean, even the idea of connecting more with nature. And, one thing that I recommend for people to take this more of a spiritual direction is to go outside, take your shoes off and stand on the ground. It's a scientifically proven thing. It's called grounding. Or flooring. I'm forgetting which one it is. Well, maybe there's multiple terms.
Yeah,
maybe. But the idea is there's actually these are scientifically verifiable reaction, a connection that you'll feel even when you're just connected to the earth and thinking about what that means, that you're just this little thing standing on this massive idea. And we need to see that we are interconnected, and that we need to break past what they're trying to do with all of this stuff, whether it's with the technocracy idea or any other things we've listed off. They're pushing us apart, and it's the illusion of connectivity. As we're closer than ever before in little apartment buildings when we never see each other, especially right now, it's more, we're getting further apart as they push us closer together. So we need to fight against that. I mean, that is a core value of what we need to be as the human species.
Well, now with COVID, right, we're scared of the other person. The other person might infect us. And before and after 9/11, it was like, we're scared that everyone could be a terrorist, right? There's this intentional push by the state and other forces to keep us apart. And so what we need to do more than anything is come together as communities, decentralize on the local level, come together on the community level. That's really how we're going to beat this at the end of the day. I don't want to keep talking because I actually have to go.
Yeah. But yeah,
this has been really enjoyable talking about all these like different topics and the doom and gloom that I normally spew out about the surveillance state. So this was nice. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thanks again. And you're right. I mean, hopefully this will be a phase and we can resist and get things back to some type of normal. But it really is bothersome when you can't even walk down the street anymore without somebody like jumping out, like, trying to walk around you and trying to avoid you in all circumstances, hoping that like they don't offend you or you don't offend them or whatever. It's like you really just, it's crazy. It's like we're all avoiding each other when really we should be coming together, and we have to resist these things, because if we don't, it's just going to keep getting worse. So
right.
All the Trump supporters out there, like, stop wearing fucking masks. If you're a real, if you guys are really anti the other side, like, I don't see why there's not more people resisting and going out and doing something. And my kids have mask exemption forms. We have religious exemption forms for vaccines. I try to be proactive. I try to practice what I preach. I don't just, during the whole lockdown, I had people at my house every weekend. I didn't care. Like I'm like, let's spread these germs. I'm like, you know what? Like this is how our immune system stays strong and and whatnot. So definitely practice what you preach. Don't just go online and say do this, do that, and then give in when it comes to time to actually stand up for what you believe. So. But thanks again, guys. Hopefully I see you guys Monday. If not, then we'll hopefully reconnect in the near future.
Absolutely, man.
All right, sounds good.
Thanks,
Thank you.
guys. Hey, thanks. Have a great weekend.
Have a good one.
Likewise.